Half Moon Bay Planning Commission, Tuesday, December 10th, 2019. We'll start with the Pledge of Allegiance. Right, and we have Commissioner Hernandez teleconferencing in, and with that we can do a roll call.
All right, so we got Hernandez on the line. Commissioner Ruddock?
Here.
Commissioner Polgar?
Here.
Vice Chair Benjamin?
Here.
And Chair Holt?
Here.
Thank you.
So, approval of minutes, November 12th.
A couple of quick changes through the chair. Thank you. In the clarifying questions, the second question with respect to the hours of operation on the item on that agenda, the comments in the minutes were actually in conflict, and I think the way you change that is just to say that we change the hours, and it's what's reflected in the motion later in the minutes. And then on page 3, the second bullet, the comment was that it's important to be respectful and sensitive to the parents with kids at the middle school and their concerns. So I would add the important to. And with those changes, I move to approve.
There's a second.
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay, now going on to public comment. This is the opportunity to provide public comments for items not on the agenda. If you wish to speak, feel free. I do have one card here from, I believe it's from Tim Pond, who I do not see in the audience, and it just says plastic fence at beach, so you can make of that what you will. Otherwise, with that, Margarita Vasquez.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Margarita Vasquez. I am a program coordinator for the Youth Leadership Institute. I would have other youth present here, however, they're totally committed with other extracurricular activities. I'm currently here to talk a little bit about a group that I help support at the Half Moon Bay High School. This group emerged out of the Team C Coalition, which is a Transportation Equity Alliance movement, which is a county-wide effort that helped pass Measure W. I guess the goal of the club on campus at the Half Moon Bay High School is to conduct research on youth needs and represent the youth voice where youth voice is not usually represented in. And today I just we've conducted a few surveys throughout the high school, 184 surveys that the youth developed and conducted throughout the high school to just see what youth think about youth engagement around city council meetings, around planning commission. So I have here some findings, and if you all have any questions, feel free to ask. I'll leave these here, or I could also pass them around. But hopefully this is not the first and last time you'll see me. We hope to get more youth engaged and learning more about planning commission, more about city council, and just getting more youth voice out here. So thank you.
Thank you very much. If you want to leave those with the staff and we can take a look. And Tim made it back just in time. We're still on public comment period. So I take it this card was from you, plastic fence at beach. That sounds like a Tim issue. Is your mic on? Is it actually green on there?
My name is Tim Pond, and I live over at 651 Potter Avenue, and I've witnessed a orange plastic fence growing along the bluff top. I might point out that the bluff top has been there for 10,000 years. For the last 100 years, we've had houses there with a bluff top, tremendous bluff top, beautiful, perfect bluff top, no fence, no problem. I admit that there is erosion in certain areas, which is causing the trail to have to be moved back soon. But I encourage you not to put plastic up without great need, because that plastic that you're putting up there will end up in a landfill. It will last for 10,000 years and decompose into chemicals that'll be here far after we're gone. And what it's doing up there, I really don't understand. If it's a safety concern, I think you're creating an attractive hazard by giving the illusion of a protective railing at the cliff, which is not what this is. This is something that kids can skirt around the edges when they're with their parents who look at a fence and see, oh, we're protected. And people can get around it. It also does not follow any building codes about having, a railing force. You have to have a certain force which you push against to keep it up. And I think that you've created a attractive hazard there. I think that if you filled in the arroyos or the little canyons with brush and natural vegetation cast off that you have, you could just as easily prevent erosion in that way, if that's what you're needing to do, and keep people away from the bluff top in those areas that you want to prevent further erosion. Thank you.
Thank you. Did you want to, Joe, you look like you
Steph
wanted
wanted
to
to
respond.
just give a quick note. This was part of the director's report, but to draw everyone's attention to the meeting tomorrow night. It's with the Parks and Recreation Commission at the library at 6 o'clock p.m., where they will provide their comments on the draft Poplar Gateways plan that includes bluff top protection measures. And so you may be interested in participating in that session to see the plan. It has near-term phase and phases, I think 3 additional phases after that for improvements. Thank you.
Thank you. So that's the end of the cards I have for public comment. If anybody else has wished to speak at this point, feel free to jump up. Maybe not jumping up. Okay, we're going to close the public comment period, and we'll move on to our first public hearing item, amendments to the Half Moon Bay zoning code for accessory dwelling units. Pass that over to Jill and Brittany.
Thank you. Good evening. So tonight we are here with an accessory dwelling unit ordinance, and we are going to give you a quick background and then move into a presentation overviewing the draft ordinance by our Deputy City Attorney, Sarah Clark, and then Brittany and I will finish up the presentation with a few things that are kind of the practical matters of how we actually implement the ordinance in working with our applicants and what we do at City Hall. So, we just did this, and I want to just acknowledge that because a lot of work went into this in 2018. You had a couple study sessions, a hearing in June. City Council actually had 2 first readings because they wanted to adjust something in the ordinance, and finally a second reading, and then it went on to the Coastal Commission where it was certified and it was considered to be de minimis. They were very satisfied with our ordinance. We did a significant amount of coordination with their staff throughout that process. And the ordinance has, well, we like it, and it's working really well. This year we've have at least 20 ADUs at some point in the pipeline where we had 3 per year. We would expect the ordinance to have continued with some level of, a higher level of throughput than what we had had in the past, but probably not sustained at 20 units to the per year. But we're here now because state law just was signed in. It's multiple assembly bills and Senate bills that were signed in that affect state ADU ordinance law, and Sarah will review that briefly in the presentation. Last time, this is actually a slide that we used when we saw you in 2018, where we were really emphasizing a whole kind of holistic reason why we were here. We were supporting our housing element policy, where we're facilitating the production of ADUs, and of course those 2 things are still true, and we were also following Coastal Commission guidance. But we are really here in this timely fashion because this was passed in October, I believe it was signed in, and state law will take effect on January 1, 2020. So with that, I will pass this over to our attorney.
Okay, yeah, So I'm going to go over the 5 different bills that were passed in this legislative session. I should note, as I think we discussed over the summer, there were even more on the table, but this is what actually made it through the gauntlet. I'm a believer in the legislative process, but this calls into question my belief in how well that works. The state law is a mess, and I know that when I walk through this, you're going to have questions. We have been working through and wrestling with a number of questions. City attorneys, county councils, and planning folks around the state are still trying to figure out exactly how this all is intended to work. We've done the best we can here, and I can answer. Sure.
Commissioner Arnett. I will turn on your microphone and see if that helps, Rick.
And this is Sarah.
Sorry.
No problem. So we'll do the best we can here tonight. The main changes are to Government Code Section 65852.2, which is known as the State ADU Law or State ADU requirements. And there were 3 bills that amended this section, AB 881, AB 68, and SB 13. Most of the changes to your ordinance that we're proposing are a result of these modifications to state law. But there are a couple of additional ones that do come in certain areas. So first, actually over the summer, AB 670 passed. And as we have previously discussed, what this bill did was remove the ability of homeowners associations to prohibit or significantly restrict the ability of folks living in developments controlled by homeowners associations to restrict ADUs. So that was a sort of sea change there. And that modification is in Civil Code Section 4751. And then finally, this is a little bit of an esoteric change, but AB 587 also now allows a separate sale of an ADU. So as you guys know, ADUs are typically located on the same lot, same parcel as a primary dwelling unit. What this new law does is it carves out pretty specific and limited circumstances in which entities could separately sell an ADU. And this is all related to providing ownership models for low-income housing. So in order to qualify under this section, it has to be a qualified organization, a nonprofit organization that's working on affordable housing issues. The price of that ADU must be limited for 30 years through deed restrictions and potentially a deed of trust. And so there's really limited circumstances in which this will apply, but you'll see references in our code now to allow the separate sale of ADUs in certain limited circumstances. So I wanted to go back and talk about the unique circumstances that do apply here in Half Moon Bay. If we were not in the coastal zone, I would be coming to you and saying, well, it's state law, and so we can't change it. There's nothing we can do. The state legislature has acted. Here we do have a slight bit of discretion to make sure that our code remains consistent with the Coastal Act. And the state legislature retains the language in the state ADU law to say that the Coastal Act is not superseded or interfered with by the state law. And so we continue to follow Coastal Commission guidance on this topic. What the Coastal Commission has said and what we've tried to apply here is to support the intention of the state ADU law and to really have it come full force into the city of Half Moon Bay, except in certain limited circumstances where there are issues that are unique and protected by the Coastal Act. And so when you have a specific finding that applying state law would interfere with the city's ability to enforce the Coastal Act and apply the Coastal Act, then you can make modifications from the state's otherwise requirements. And so we talked about this last time around with respect to coastal access and parking, and we continue to carry those forward. I know there's been some questions about applications of protections for things like ESHA or other environmental resources. Those remain in our code, and we remain able to prevent development of an ADU that would impact an ESHA or other specific listed Coastal Act resources. Likewise, for coastal hazards, same issue. If there's a coastal hazard, the city could act to protect against that. And we will continue to see, you'll see here, last time around we made pretty significant modifications to the way CDP permitting went, coastal development permit requirements for ADUs. And so we've provided some streamlined exemptions and then administrative CDPs for ADUs, and those will continue to apply the way that we drafted them the last time around. There's a few minor wordsmithing edits that we made to those sections, but for the most part, the substantive law still applies. So I'm going to go through sort of in chunks now what the ordinance does and talk you through both where we were before this proposed amendment and then what the proposed amendment does. So first, key question, zoning districts where the ADUs are allowed. So from the 2018 ordinance, the city really expanded where ADUs were allowed per state law. So we see them in R1, R2, R3. These are the city's primary residential units. But we also allowed ADUs in all mixed-use districts. So CD, CR, CVS, and CG. These continue to be applicable in the ordinance moving forward. In 2018, we also considered whether to include the urban reserve or open space reserve areas in the ordinance, and ultimately made a finding that ADUs in these areas were in conflict with the Coastal Act. And so we determined not to have ADUs in these areas, and that discretion has been retained. Finally, in the 2018 ordinance, we did not include the PUD and PUDX areas for a couple of reasons. The primary finding that we made was that ADUs in these areas would potentially impact visual resources. And in further consideration on this area, on the PUD and PUDX area, as well as in consideration of the state law's real admonition that cities need to allow ADUs in a streamlined fashion in certain areas, as well as the removal of the homeowners association ability to limit ADUs in homeowners association documents, we have added back in the PUD and PUDX, but in a very specific way. So the state law allows streamlined ADUs within existing space. So when you're converting an existing single-family residence or accessory structure, that's one type of streamlined ADUs. And in the proposed ordinance, we're allowing such streamlined ADUs in the PUD and PUDX designations, but not any other types of ADUs. And we're continuing to make the finding based on the visual resource nature of the PUDs. So I mentioned streamlined ADUs, and I'm going to go through sort of 4 categories here. So in the previous iteration of state law, we had one category of streamlined ADUs, and those are the ones that, do I have a pointer or no? You can't see that. Oh, it's dying on me. The upper left quadrant, these are streamlined ADUs that are within existing space. So if you have a single-family residence or an accessory structure, you're allowed to convert that to an accessory dwelling unit with really minimal requirements. The one thing that's changed here is that you can now, state law now requires that cities allow a conversion to what's called a junior accessory dwelling unit, or JDU. JDUs are, they have very specific requirements. They have to be less than 500 square feet. They have to have an owner occupancy requirement. They have to have both exterior access as well as access into the main house. They have to be a conversion of an existing bedroom. And they can share bathroom facilities, but they need to have their own kitchen facilities. So state law now says that we have to allow JDUs if that's what people want to do. In general, there hasn't been a high demand for JDUs because the requirements are so specific and you can really get most of what you want through the ADU process, but nevertheless, the state legislature wants us to allow them, so we've done that. And then the other things that have really been a sea change in this year's legislative process is the expansion of streamlined ADUs to include these 4 separate, or these 3 other categories. So the main one is this that you see in the bottom left-hand corner, or for new detached ADUs. What state law now says is that cities are required to allow property owners to build one ADU on their lot, so long it is a detached new construction, and it meets pretty minimal height and setback requirements, namely that it meets a 4-foot side and rear yard setback requirement, that it is no larger than 800 square feet, and that it has meets a 16-foot height limitation. Pretty much as long as those requirements are met, the city is required to allow a property owner to build that type of ADU. And that must be on a lot where there is either an existing or proposed single-family home. We also have 2 streamlined categories for ADUs on multifamily, or on lots with existing multifamily dwellings. Probably less of an issue here in Half Moon Bay, given that we have relatively fewer multifamily dwellings than in other jurisdictions, but still important. The first one is a little bit odd, but this is sort of, again, a wholly within existing space kind of idea. And this provision allows owners of multifamily dwellings to convert non-livable space. And the state law actually lists out things like boiler rooms or attics or basements or like crawl spaces. So long as you can meet building code requirements for habitable space, you can convert that non-livable space to an ADU. And the city is required to allow at least one ADU in a multifamily dwelling unit, and up to the amount of 25% of the existing units. So if you had a 12-unit building, we would have to allow up to 3 ADUs in that particular space. The second type of multifamily streamlined ADUs that we get are new detached ADUs. Again, this is somewhat of a sea change here. So on multifamily lots, the city is required to allow up to 2 ADUs. Again, they must be detached and new construction, and they must meet a 4-foot side and rear yard setback and a 16-foot height max. One important thing to note, there is no size limitation on these types of ADUs per state law. So that is a definite change. So when we get outside of the streamlined categories, and it's really important to sort of think about ADU law as like a decision tree. So you first look at those streamlined ADUs and you determine, does this ADU meet any of the requirements in one of these 4 categories? And if it does, it just moves to permitting, no imposition of additional requirements except for Coastal Act requirements on those types of streamlined ADUs. If you don't meet those criteria and you're outside the bucket of a streamlined ADU, then the city can impose both its standard development requirements as well as any other sort of generally applicable development requirements. And so right now I'm going to talk about maximum size. But again, remember, we're now talking about non-streamlined ADUs, so sort of anything that falls outside of those buckets. The main things that really we're covering here are attached ADUs. If you noted that we talked about within existing space and we talked about detached ADUs, but that first streamlined bucket did not cover attached ADUs. We're also talking about ADUs that are larger than 800 square feet and are detached. So those are the 2 categories that we're going to talk through on these next couple of slides. So for these types of units, the maximum size for these units in the 2018 ordinance was 800 square feet, and wholly within there was no limit on those. And for the streamlined, you'll see they have to comply with the size limits that we just talked about. But this last category for other ADUs, what the state law now says is it sets a minimum maximum. So it limits how low cities can set their maximum size requirements. Essentially, cities can go no lower than 850 square feet for 1-bedroom ADUs and no lower than 1,000 square feet for ADUs that have 2 or more bedrooms. And so we've adopted those requirements. We're not intending to go higher than that, although the city retains discretion to do so if it wants. These are the limits that planning staff feels comfortable with. Again, for these non-streamlined ADUs, we can continue to require compliance with lot coverage, FAR, and height requirements, as well as other standard applicable development requirements that apply through the state's or through the city's zoning code. The one important thing to note here, and I know we've received some public comment about this, is that for lot coverage and FAR, we actually can no longer, you can apply them, but only to a limit. So you can apply them to reduce an ADU from 1,000 feet down to 800 square feet, but you cannot use lot coverage or FAR to reduce below 800 square feet or below a 16-foot height limit. So it sort of sets a floor for how far and what impact lot coverage, FAR, and height requirements can apply. Okay, parking requirements. In some ways, this is one area where the state had already eroded a lot of local control, and so we don't see too many changes here. In 2018, the requirement was you could sometimes allow parking requirements for ADUs, but not within a half mile of a transit stop. And given Half Moon Bay's geography and the fact that we have transit stops on Highway 1, virtually all of the city fell outside of the places where we could require parking. And so what the city did at that time is adopted a very narrowly tailored parking requirement to still impose parking requirements for ADUs where coastal access was really going to be affected by a lack of street parking. And so for the most part, the city's current ordinance does not require parking for ADUs. However, we do have these narrow exceptions that are shown in the map that's still current in the ordinance. So that still applies. Streamlined ADUs, however, no parking required regardless of location. This is the map of the parking requirements. Short-term rentals. In 2018, we adopted essentially a ban on short-term rentals and ADUs, except for short-term rentals that were already operating as of the effective date. We have brought that forward for non-streamlined ADUs, but actually per state law, in streamlined ADUs, no short-term rentals are allowed. And so we have carved out that requirement for those streamlined ADUs. Another big sea change here, and I know one that is going to be of concern to folks probably in this room and at the City Council, are occupancy requirements. So for ADUs in our existing code, deed restrictions require, I should say, it's actually declarations of restrictions, require owner occupancy of either the ADU or the single family home. And the city had been relying on this as a way to prevent, in large part to prevent short-term rentals from really, or short-term rentals and other uses from preventing the use of ADUs as really affordable housing. But the state stripped the ability of local jurisdictions to impose occupancy requirements in the latest ordinance. Sort of interesting how this will apply because the ADUs that were built under the prior code are still going to be subject to those requirements. That's not proposed to change. But for any ADUs built moving forward, they will not be subject to it. So we'll have this sort of like distinction between ADUs based on when they were built. The other thing that's interesting about this part of state law is it sunsets after 5 years. And so it's possible that in 5 years we may be able to go back to requiring occupancy restrictions on ADUs. And so it'll be restrictions based on time of building rather than any other sort of policy reason. And I'm going to turn it over now to Brittany.
All right, so in addition to all of the changes that Sarah just went through about the categories of ADUs and the development standards that apply with the changes proposed in the new ordinance, there are a couple changes to the permit processing included in the draft ordinance. So our current ordinance requires permits, coastal development permits for ADUs to be processed within 120 days. The new ordinance cuts that in half to 60 days. In actual practice, we are processing these through the planning department in about 30 days. So we're well within the range of what is required. Building permits, also relatively streamlined. On average, we're getting through those in about 45 days, typically through one round of plan check, which is much quicker than the typical single-family residence, which typically requires 2 rounds. And we are actively working with our plan check review partners at the fire and water districts on ways to continuously streamline our review processes, and will continue to do so with this update. The Measure D certificate process is relatively the same. Measure D certificates will still be required. We now have the new category of junior ADUs that will also require Measure D certificates. So the current code does not require a fee for Measure D certificates and does allow concurrent application with the CDP application. This will be carried forward, and no changes are proposed there. So this year we issued a significant 23 Measure D certificates for ADUs specifically, and we ran out of the outside of downtown Measure D certificates by September 1st. This was really the only holdup we saw in permit processing time for ADUs. And we did have to hold a few in a holding pattern, waiting for City Council's September resolution clarifying the process for transferring those allocations from downtown to outside of downtown. We are anticipating this to occur again next year, as there are increasing allowances for ADUs as well as junior ADUs. So there's now 2 types of ADUs that can be allowed on one lot. So we do anticipate running out or getting close. So with the larger ADUs that are allowed under this new code, to be consistent with state law, we could also consider charging a fee for Measure D certificates that are larger, for the larger ADUs. And Jill will go through that now with impact fees.
So when we updated our code in 2018, we continued to not charge impact fees for accessory dwelling units. We hadn't been charging them previously, and we moved forward not charging them. The state law provides for, however, that cities can charge impact fees for ADUs over 750 square feet. Staff is proposing that we do that. This is really opening the door to a lot of development that otherwise would not be contributing to some of these really standard mitigation fees that have been studied over time. And this slide is just highlighting a few of the most basic fees that we charge, and then Measure D is down in the bottom row there, just kicked in, and then I realized I used last year's number. It should be about $30 higher. But for the relativity of this, let's use this example. So the way, and it surprised me, the way that this, I hope they fix this and clean up code. So I'll walk through, and we're happy to answer clarifying questions. The first column shows our impact fees that are on the books now for single-family homes. The city does not have a specific impact fee category for ADUs. We have impact fees for all kinds of commercial development, single-family homes, and multifamily development. So state law, I think, probably predicted that most cities wouldn't have done nexus studies establishing impact fees for ADUs, and they provided a code for how to do it. And so you will see that we're proposing to use it. The way that it works is you can charge the proportion of how large the ADU is relative to the house on the site. So for the first example, we're taking a big ADU because it would have to be over 750 square feet, and using round numbers here, big ADU with a modest-sized home of 1,500 square feet means that that particular applicant would have to pay 2/3 of all the single-family development impact fees. And so then if you look at the example of the same sized ADU on hopefully a larger lot with a large house, a 3,000 square foot home, they're only having to pay 1/3. And we really hope they clean that up. We like everybody who's developing an ADU to pay the same, but this is all we have available to us right now, and as staff, I really feel strongly about getting impact fees at this stage with how little discretion has been left open for cities. You'll notice just about every call that we could make, we tried to choose what we could that was conservative, scaled to Half Moon Bay's lots, maintained development standards that are consistent with the districts as they have been for as long as you've known them. And so this is one area where we'd encourage it. It could potentially have the intended consequence of having somebody come in with a smaller unit. And that was the intent for ADUs. They were supposed to be small and more affordable. So understanding though that there's flexibility around that. So we're just proposing that, and it's allowed. And other than for the fact of the very strange formula that was provided to us, it's mostly fair, and we hope it will be improved. Thank you. All right. So we would, in our draft code, we would need to make a tweak to note that early in the code where we reference the residential dwelling unit allocation that they would be processed without a fee for ADUs under 750 square feet. We did not include that in this this version of the code. So we'll want your input on that. Of course, this is a matter that is wholly for City Council discretion, and your recommendation will be valuable to them. A couple other things came up today. I had an opportunity to talk with Commissioner Benjamin, and he brought up a really good point about the definition of structure. It's it's used a lot in the ADU code, and in Half Moon Bay's zoning ordinance, the definition of structure is very, very broad. So we talked about that with Sarah, and she's got a way to approach this for tightening up a definition that would be part of the universe of this chapter 33 of your code, to be a little clearer about that, so we aren't coming up with unintended consequences there. Also, the topic of non-conforming development, and there's so many places where non-conforming development is allowed to be converted into ADU space without changing its footprint or anything else. We're used to having non-conforming development in a situation where if there's any addition, the addition cannot increase the non-conformance, and typically you'll have a resulting structure that is either non-conforming to the same or a lesser extent when you're done. In this circumstance, non-conforming setbacks, lot coverage, heights, all of those components of the bulk of the structure could be retained. It does not mean that we would have to retain things that are health and safety issues. If wiring needs to get upgraded, if there's a fire code issue, if there's some other component of the building construction that is not appropriate and meeting building codes for these units, then those things must be updated when the units are permitted. So I hope that provides a little bit of clarification, and that's the last content that we have to present, and we're hoping that you'll ask us really clarifying questions if you have them now, and then this is a public hearing item, and that's what we've got. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So, I do have a couple speakers cards, but are there any specific clarifying questions at this time? Okay, Commissioner Reddick.
Thank you all very much for that weighty and but insightful analysis of what's going on with the new state laws. Just so I'm 100% sure that I get it, with the new state laws, Sarah, did you say that short-term rental is banned in their broader vision of streamlined ADUs now?
Yes, so in those 4 categories, within existing multifamily, new detached and multifamily, within existing single family and new detached single family that meets the size requirements, no short-term rentals are allowed, even if they were grandfathered appropriately.
Thank you for that. And my last question is the question of ADUs in the PUDs, and there's a nuance there about attached versus within existing structures. Could you say that again, just so I'm clear that I have that?
Sure. So for PUDs, what we've proposed in this code is that ADUs would only be allowed if they are a conversion of existing space. And so that's a conversion of space within an existing single-family home or a conversion of an accessory structure, so something like a garage. And the reason why we are proposing to allow those ADUs to move forward in the PUDs is because the finding as to why ADUs, other ADUs aren't to be allowed is because of visual resource impacts. And given that these types of ADUs are wholly within structures that are already existing, it's somewhat difficult to make those visual resource findings.
Yeah, I wasn't sure what exactly the definition of attached was in that case.
Yeah, so attached generally in this context, in the ADU context, generally refers to ADUs that are attached to single-family homes but involve new construction. So for instance, if you have a square house and you want to kick out a back 800 square foot addition, that would be something that we refer to as attached.
Thank you very much.
Commissioner Benjamin.
Thank you. So a lot of questions were answered. It left me with a couple that I just want to try to drill down on a bit. The first one was to take a closer look at that AB 587 corner case involving the sale of an ADU under special circumstances. And I heard you mention, it sort of pricked my ear when I heard that those units would only be guaranteed to be affordable for 30 years, because that means we're imposing on a planning commission 30 years from now the need to provide affordable housing stock. We're imposing a problem for them to solve with less resources than we have today to solve. So I'm hopeful that we have some discretion to make it longer, and if we don't, well, I'll get to that. So I guess the question is, do we have discretion?
Unfortunately, no. So this is a pretty unusual circumstance. So under the Subdivision Map Act, generally speaking, you can't just create a separate property interest that can be sold separately without complying with the terms of the Subdivision Map Act. So this is a very narrow and specifically tailored subsection. The state law is what references that 30-year requirement, and so I would be pretty uncomfortable trying to modify that, given that I think we would then run afoul of the Subdivision Map Act requirements for not subdividing in other situations.
So it's not, so it actually declares a specific duration.
Yes.
It can't be less and it can't be more.
Yes, that's correct.
Wow. Okay, so that's an illustration of a more general question I have, which was you were kind enough to give us that list of assembly bills, or in one case a Senate bill, and explaining that those are providing the basis for these changes, that they mandate these changes. One thing we've done in the local coastal program discussion that has been really helpful for people who have reservations or want to track the changes very closely is to show a concordance where we see what change we're proposing in the statute, and there's a line back to a specific chapter and verse. And I wonder if that's available or could easily be made available so that we can address any potential question about whether, you know, everybody can have the same, bring the same insight or have the insight that you had when you helped us produce these changes.
Sure, I would be happy to prepare something like that for City Council consideration when it goes there and for the public to consider. I will note that in my estimate, 90 to 95% of what you are seeing before you is because of state law requirements. It is the vast majority of the code changes that we are making. There are very few areas where the state has left the cities with discretion in this area. So just so you can get a sense. So for example, in the Streamlined ordinance, the only place you're left with any discretion is you can impose an 800 square foot and 16 size requirement and a 16-foot height requirement on those detached units on single family lots. That is the one thing you can do. It says it has to be that specific numerical amount, but you could choose not to impose them if you wanted to. That's the one piece of discretion you're left. You have a little bit more in the non-streamlined categories, but again, it's really pretty much limited to some questions around maximum size, around what specific other standards you want to apply, but other than that, it's not much.
Yeah. And I want to be sure that this doesn't imply a sense of prejudice about this. The idea here is, in science, you know, we produce results, we publish them, so other people can think it through and ask the hard questions.
I do want to make sure that we get the public's comments before we get too deep into discussion.
Right.
So if you could just keep your questions tight.
Right. So next question. Does the fee changes that we've proposed recover our costs?
So if you're referring to cost of
Process ADU permit.
processing an ADU permit for a administrative coastal development permit is a flat fee, and the flat fee was scaled to our estimate of how many hours of staff time are required. So it's on average it works, and then the building permit fees cover the cost of all of the work that goes into plan check and building inspection.
Okay, I'll try to understand that better during discussion. And my last clarifying question was with respect to these non-conforming properties of areas that are being converted into an ADU. I'm really happy to hear about electrical and, you know, fire code and things like that. What about insulation? Would that be something, you know, if someone started with an uninsulated, uninhabited space, would we regard that as something that had to be remedied under the draft code? Don't know.
Well, what I can tell you is what the code says, and the code requires that a streamlined ADU, which are the places where these nonconformities are most applicable, still has to comply with applicable building codes and health and safety regulations. I don't know for certain whether insulation is considered something along those lines, but
what about traffic safety? So, like, if you had a place where there was no off-street parking, you would have to park on a curb or something like that.
I don't believe we could require modifications to the street frontage to address traffic
Thank you
concerns.
for your forbearance.
Okay, Commissioner Polgar.
All right. Thank you for taking us through this rather challenging process. So I have a couple, hopefully very quick clarifying questions. One has to do with if there's a proposed dwelling, single-family home dwelling, as well as an ADU that fits and the ADU fits in the streamlining process, what does that mean for the single-family, the new single-family home? Does it suddenly, does it go on a different permitting process timeline than the ADU?
Sure. So this particular question, the code section you should look at is 1833050, which is combination proposals, and it sort of talks about the options that the city provides. So typically, and the way that the state law envisions it, is that you would submit your application for both, toll the time requirement for your ADU while your single family is processing, and then once your single family is permitted, then you would do the ADU afterwards. What our code does is gives applicants actually a different option, which is if you want the city to consider these both at the same time, we can go ahead and do that, so you're not coming back for a second round of permits after you've just completed your first one. This is intended to give property owners a faster timeline to getting all the way to the end of the process. And I believe that that is what a number of folks have done, have utilized in the past, since our last code amendments came on, and we continue to do that. The one change to this section that is, again, a state law requirement is about the order of certificates of occupancy. So what the state law now requires is you can't get your certificate of occupancy, which is the final document that you get before you can move in. You can't get that for your ADU before you get the one for your single family residence, which is a little bit odd in my mind. I mean, you could imagine a scenario where we actually want to let someone build their ADU first, be able to live on the property while the construction is going on in their single family residence, but unfortunately we cannot allow that.
Thank you. I had another question was about, there's the discussion of converting an existing non-livable space, and one of them, of course, could be a garage. And so if, and that's under that streamlined process. So does that just basically the parking's lost? So if that garage was part of the parking and now you're adding more, okay.
Yeah.
I just wanted to clarify and make sure I understood that.
Yeah, and what we've done again is for garage conversions in those specific areas for coastal access parking, we will require replacement of those sites in that particular area. For everything else, unfortunately, we can't.
Sorry, I have one more. So I also wanted to find out if there's a section about emergency situations, and I was wondering if this would still apply to the other ADUs. I think it's 17.06.025, and it's kind of a way for the city to be able to deal with emergencies, if there's some sort of shortage of supply. It's just I couldn't tell if it was part of Measure D in the code, and it was something that would be factored into how this new ordinance is implemented, or if it also doesn't, these new requirements of the state kind of override that as well. But anyways, it's something that maybe I did want clarification on.
I think we'll unfortunately need to look into that more. You said, what's the section you cited to?
It's 17.06.025.
Okay. I'll see if I can look at that during public comment and get back to you on that.
And then one last thing that just another clarification is in the review and approval, there's the conversion of existing residents, and then there's I think that's C, and then there's a discussion of density, E. And I was wondering how those interact. So if you convert an existing residence to an ADU and build a new primary dwelling unit, does the review of the new primary unit assume that nothing exists on the lot? Because there is this allowance for you have an existing structure and you can convert it to an ADU. So you make that, and then you could build a new primary dwelling unit. And so is it when, as a city staff, we're looking at, okay, well, what's on the lot area cover or floor area coverage or something? I forgot the acronym, but is it as if there's nothing there now, or basically you have to assume that there's nothing there?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think if you're otherwise meeting your conversion requirements, that would probably be how we would process that. We haven't encountered something like that before, so
Okay.
I'll need to think about that a little bit more, because it sort of depends a bit on how the application is set up and the timing considerations.
Mr. Benjamin, you had another.
I'm sorry, I know I'm trying your patience.
No.
The community development director pointed out that the use of the word structure in the proposed changes could have unintended consequences, and that there was a proposal from the city attorney for about how to deal with that. Since we're being asked to consider adopting tonight, it might be good to know what that proposal is. Can you tell us more?
What my proposal is, and I don't have the exact language for you tonight, but the idea would be that we are using accessory structure in this ordinance specifically to refer to structures that are already enclosed. So it wouldn't apply to structures like a deck or a pool or a archway or things like that can't obviously convert those things to an ADU, but we don't want to make any confusion. And so while I don't have exact language for you, our goal would be to create a definition within 1833 that specifically says within this chapter, accessory structure is much like the city's existing definition of accessory structure, except it's limited to spaces that are already enclosed.
It's tricky because there's still sunroom, but thank you.
Commissioner Hernandez, do you have any?
Can I ask a question?
Yes, that's
Yeah.
what I was just asking.
So two-part question. The first part is, when we look at floor area ratios for new housing, it's an important part of what we think about. We want to have livable space on a lot. Do floor area ratios apply to ADUs and JADUs and all of these new structures we're talking about?
So floor area ratio only applies, well, first off, it definitely applies to new non-streamlined ADUs. So the new attached ADUs that are larger than 800 square feet. At the time of your application for your streamlined ADU, the city does not apply the FAR or site coverage ratios, that sort of thing. However, the scenario in which it would still apply is if you have your single family residence, you use the streamlining provisions to build your ADU, and then a year later you come back and are asking the city to have an addition to your single family home. In that circumstance, the ADU would count towards FAR. So it's not like a nothing. It's not a zero. It doesn't count as nothing. It's just that we can't use FAR to prevent the approval of an ADU.
So thank you. It would be really great to make sure we document that in any guidelines we put in front of the citizenry it's good for people to know the future restrictions are going to be put in place. The second question I have is, what's to prevent me from putting 6 ADUs in my backyard?
Sure. So it's specifically not allowed under the code. Under the streamlined sections that we've drafted, you're only allowed 1 ADU, and I'm talking only about the single family requirements. So those say you can only have 1 ADU per lot unless you have this scenario where you have a streamlined detached ADU and a streamlined JDU, then you're allowed 2 per lot. But you would never be allowed more than that. On multifamily, you could build up to 2 detached or up to sort of a 25% of the existing number of dwelling units for multifamily wholly within. But I don't think you'd ever get up to 6.
Well, it's, I mean, you could fill your entire backyard with tar paper shacks effectively that we have very little control over. I'm just concerned that we're going to have situations where people push this to the extremes, and I'd like to figure out what we can do to put reasonable controls in place. I think it's totally the right thing to do to allow people to have ADUs, to have streamlined ADUs, but I worry about people who push things to their maximum logical position, and I just want to have us think about those worst case scenarios and just plan from them, either making it more expensive or figuring out how to pump the brakes for those kinds of things if we can.
Yeah, so I think you've highlighted this worry about conversion of existing accessory structures. And I do want to make clear that even if you are building non-conforming, non-permitted tar paper shacks in your backyard, you're still only allowed under our code to convert one of those. So you might be able to hop through some hoops by building that unpermitted structure. Certainly the city could always come in before you apply for your ADU and cite you for code violations. That's not something that is allowed under the city's code, and we don't want to create that impression. But Jill, you look like you might want to add something as well.
And they would also have to conform to building code in doing the conversion. So you would get a building permit and inspections and required to meet health and safety standards.
Additional questions, Rick?
I'm good, thank you.
Okay. With that, I'm going to open up the public comment period. I've got 3 speaker cards here. The first speaker, Mike Ferreira.
Good evening, Chair Holt, Mike Ferreira. Well, I have addressed this issue in the past, both here and at the council. And I'll try to address primarily the issue of the PUDs. During your joint session with the council, I think you all saw that the council was very interested in retaining some of the larger PUD zoning and not changing out of it. And when the 2018 ordinance was done, the council was pretty emphatic about taking at least the 2 major PUDs out of the ADU ordinance. That's Pacific Ridge and Ocean Colony. And I know that staff was accommodating, and staff said that, well, okay, we can use views or something as a reason for it. But I do know that the reason that a lot of the council members had is that the state law says we have to do ADUs where it's zoned for housing. And a PUD does not specifically do that, just like open space doesn't do that, and open space reserve doesn't do that, and urban reserve doesn't do that. And in fact, we have PUDs that'll never see housing. So in their way of thinking, they didn't have to do ADUs in where PUD zoning was retained. That was their thinking, and that's why those changes were made to the ADU ordinance. So now we're here with proposed changes to that. And the word compromise is in that there, that we're compromising with something, and I guess I have to ask, we're compromising with who? The legislature? I don't think the legislature compromises anything. So I think the council thinks they're on the right side of the law. The law hasn't changed in that regard since the council made that decision. So that's, and I've spoken to an attorney that's familiar with this stuff. And so I think we really need some better description. Otherwise, it kind of, we have the impression that the Planning Commission is being requested to go against the council's judgment. So we should, I think, have a strong reason for doing that if that's what you want to do. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker I have is Jewel Silver.
Good evening. My comment is really a question. As I go around Alita Park, I see more and more RVs and trailers in front lots, usually in driveways. Sometimes they may very well be lived in, sometimes maybe not. I'm wondering whether this is something that we can expect to see a lot more of with, well, I think I've said it. I'm wondering whether we're going to see a lot more of this, because it certainly is visual degradation for the streetscape. Thank you.
The last speaker card that I have here is Mr. Tim Pond.
Tim Pond, I'm 651 Potter. First of all, I've designed about 10 to 20 ADUs in the coast side so far, and I've built a few of them. And I'd just like to say that I think the smaller house and the way this is going is the only way for us to have a housing future in California. That if we have taken 50% of the land and dedicated it to 20% of the housing with the single-family house development, which basically followed the automobile out in this spider web of subdivisions, taking up all the land, using all the water and irrigation. And what we have to do is rethink our housing model, especially since I'm called a boomer by my kids. I'm aging out of my house. I don't have the need for the space. I don't have the need for the yard. And this is a real way to redirect our development in a way that fits our demographic. The people that I'm building for are people that are aging out of their houses. They have kids that can't afford to live here. They need the rental income to make their house affordable, because this is an affordable housing issue as well. It makes a person able to buy a home in this area that would not be able to buy a home and afford the mortgage reasonably, or afford to retire here. They have to live in their house for 20 years when they have kids, and then leave the neighborhood they lived in to move somewhere else because they can't sustain and have no need for the house they live in, and this gives them the space that they need. Also, you can make these completely energy self-sufficient with solar panels and electric heat. They become 100% off-the-grid housing very easily. The new code has solar panels in it. You use a split system heater. I assure that the person who is concerned about the insulation, these will be insulated to Title 24, and not only that, they will be ventilated for fresh air as well. You have ventilation requirements, insulation requirements. The new Title 24 code cycle coming up is more stringent than ever. So I like the lot area and floor area exceptions as well, because there's a lot of houses here that are built in such a way that they're either 50% of the lot and have all the floor area they can use, and somebody would like to build onto their garage and go above 16 feet, but they can't do that, or they can't utilize the extra space in their lot because of the way it was developed. I'm one of those people. I have a slightly over lot coverage. I'd like to put an ADU. I could do it, but it'd be very small, and if I had that a little bit of extra lot coverage to do the ADU, it would help me a lot. And I don't think that fees should be portioned as I saw up there. That was scary, the fee portionment. I don't see why you'd charge a person who has a huge house less money. That didn't make any sense at all. It seemed like it'd be the other way, that this person with the smaller house should have a lesser impact fee. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's the last speaker card I have, so I'm going to close the public comment period unless somebody jumps up real quick. So we'll close. Bringing it back to the commission. I just had a couple quick questions for you, Joe, following up on some of the public comments. Well, first the question, nothing in this ordinance pertains to recreational vehicles, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, and nothing that's in this ordinance would necessarily change any other requirements in terms of the need to manage stormwater or comply with building codes or any of those other things, right?
All those things need to be complied with.
So all the standards, sort of building review and everything that the building department and the other codes that apply to this are all still in effect. Mike Ferreira had a question on the compromise in the PUDs, and I have jotted down here, asked Jill this question. I'm not exactly sure what I was going to ask, other than I think I want to understand a little bit about why that decision was made to move into allow the ADUs and the PUD areas.
Sure. So I want to start from the code language that we get from state law about where cities are required to allow ADUs. And those are in areas that are zoned to allow single-family or multifamily dwelling residential use. This was a change from the ADU law that was adopted from 2017 prior, where it used to say that it was in single-family or multifamily zones, which could be interpreted more narrowly to include only zones that have that sort of very strict residential designation. The state legislature changed the law, and the legislative history supports the idea that the change was made to require cities to allow ADUs wherever single-family and multifamily residential use is allowed. So we can't narrowly define it to just residential neighborhoods. It has to be wherever you allow single-family housing or wherever you allow multifamily housing, we have to also allow ADUs. And so it's always been my position and staff's position that we have articulated to the City Council during the last go-around that zones that allow single-family and multifamily residential use are required to be open for ADUs, with the exception of whether we could make a Coastal Act related finding that would otherwise limit. So again, if we were not in Half Moon Bay and we were in another city without a Coastal Act implications, I believe that the PUD zones and the urban reserve and open space reserve areas would need to be open for ADUs. But because the City Council expressed concern about visual resource impacts specifically tied to the Coastal Act, we made a modification to exempt the PUD areas from the requirements of ADUs. Because of the streamlining requirements and also the modifications. So I would want to also add that in some ways what we did in the prior go-round was an exercise that had no on-the-ground implications because of the application of homeowner association requirements in our residential PUDs. Because state law has now modified those, we're in a situation where there's no longer the ability for homeowners associations to prohibit ADUs. And so it just poses a slightly different question now with more impact on the ground. So for those reasons, we are proposing this change to the PUDs where we're opening them to ADUs that are, again, wholly within existing structures or single-family residences. I felt like I wanted to say one more thing. Nope, it slipped my mind. That's if it comes back to me, I'll.
Very good, thank you. Just a couple comments from me. Well, one, I want to acknowledge Jules for comments about just Arleta Park and recreational vehicles and that type of thing. I've noticed that as well. I'm not saying that that's necessarily a bad thing or that I'm assuming that people are living in it, but I've just noticed just in general there's a need for housing, not just in Half Moon Bay, but in lots of places. I know it doesn't feel good to have the state telling us what we should be doing at a local land use level, but I think on a statewide level, it's gotten to the point where obviously there was some action that needed to be taken. So all in all, I agree with the intent of the state. I sympathize that it's messy and that there's going to be lots of questions moving forward and probably lots of ambiguity, and we probably won't be able to solve every possible scenario and every possible question that might be raised tonight regarding around, I'm sure there's concerns around parking, around stormwater, around, any number of different things, but I think knowing that there's, a number of different avenues and codes and other things that govern those give me some level of comfort, and also recognizing that while this is a divergence from the existing code that we had, takes away some of our discretion. It doesn't necessarily expand it that much, and it encourages more of housing that I do agree is really key to us solving our concerns here. I firmly believe that we cannot protect the open spaces and protect the most sensitive resources that we have on the coast without providing more housing within the existing developed footprint. And that, I think, is a single-family home. So, and overall, I see this ordinance as really, as was stated, little discretion from us and 95% coming from the state. So, so with that, I'm prepared to move it forward. I'm sure there's going to be a fair amount of comment and questions on it. And like I said, I think that's fair and that's good. I think there'll probably be comments and questions on this for some time coming. With that, those are my comments at this point.
Can
Yeah,
I
please,
remembered my one item.
Okay.
Which is that for those PUDs where residential uses are not allowed, we do recognize that PUDs might apply differently. Even though those would be listed in the code as a possible place for an ADU, you would never actually be able to build one because you don't have an existing primary residence. Exactly. And to answer the question that was posed in public comment about site coverage, we do propose this tweak that's required by state law for site coverage, and so it still applies, but it can't apply to restrict the development of an 800 square foot ADU. So you can get at least that on a lot. It's just site coverage requirements would apply if you're trying to go bigger than that.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Claire. Additional question, comments? Commissioner Vanderman.
Thank you. So I appreciate your observation about the extent to which this is framed as implementing the legislative requirements, the demands that are placed on us. And as a city, I hate wasting time thinking about things that I don't have any discretion over. That's why I think that, it's sort of like when you get a court order. If you think you shouldn't do something in the court orders you do, you can agonize as much as you want about it, but if the court says you got to do it, you either appeal it or you got to do it. That's why I think it's really going to be helpful to have that concordance that says, here's the chapter and verse where that works. And I think, I'm not arguing that we don't have it or that it can't be made. I just think it's really important for us to have it. And I want that. And I think the public wants it as well. With respect to the location of the housing, I agree there's a housing emergency. Even with people leaving the state, there's a housing emergency. Understanding that we increase the density in Half Moon Bay without having jobs means that we're sentencing our commuters to additional traffic. It's going to be hard to grow the jobs at the kind of densities that we're talking about. That's certainly not our projection of how we expect to grow. But again, if the state's mandating it, I get it. We need to step on over and do that. I also appreciate the recognition that hazards and coastal resources and coastal access mandates in the Coastal Act are respected despite these changes. I appreciate the attention to that was given by staff and apparently also by the legislature. One of my concerns, and the reason I asked the question about whether our costs are covered or not when we're processing these, is that sometimes the data that we're working with to make decisions about hazards is it's not very accurate. As a case in point, I've shared with my colleagues on the Planning Commission, and I can share with the city manager if you can pass that over, a copy of the FEMA flood rate insurance map for the city of Half Moon Bay. And what you'll see here is these blue areas that are described by FEMA as areas where there's flooding. And you can see the tributaries that feed into Pilarcitos Creek, Apollonio Creek, and I forget the name of the other one that comes in from the north. And you can also see when that gets down to where it meets with Arroyo Leon, back behind downtown. And What's remarkable in this map is the miracle of the confluence of Palacios Creek and Arroyo Leon, where the flood zone disappears entirely. If you didn't know the area, you just assumed that the stream is flowing further south. But of course, the stream isn't flowing further south. This is a confluence, and it's going to go on down. And there's no flood zone there. In fact, there's no flood zone on Pullman, where we know flooding has occurred. There's no flood zone on Roosevelt Creek, where we know flooding is occurring. And if we ask our staff to make decisions about where habitable structures, ADUs, can be built with faulty information, and they don't have the resources to process them, we're putting the most vulnerable citizens that we're trying to help in harm's way. And to me, that seems fundamentally wrong. So I am concerned about that. I'll reload and let others speak. Thank you.
Commissioner Wright, sorry.
Thanks, Brian. I'd like to support really strongly what Brian said a few minutes ago, more articulately than I would, but the goal of meeting our housing challenges and protecting open space obviously can't be done without looking to solutions like this, where we get innovative about housing within its existing footprint. So while there's a lot we may not like about having this imposed upon the city of Half Moon Bay, I think that the long-term strategy is a good one, is a strong one. Jill, I know that when we were talking about the PUDs not long ago, you predicted to us that state law would come forward and eliminate homeowners association rights to ban ADUs from such places. Would I, maybe this is too hypothetical, but given the new state law and given what we contemplate here today, would we anticipate that in a place like Ocean Colony that ADUs would go forward at least in the permitted forms?
We can imagine a number of configurations that would benefit residents of Ocean Colony, and I've talked to quite a few residents of Ocean Colony who are looking to the future where, well, similar to public comment you had, they're knocking around in a really big house and they don't want to move, and a wholly within ADU is a potential opportunity for them in terms of income, potentially companionship, and other kinds of benefits that you've heard about, and it's really not, me in terms of expertise around that, but you can imagine all of those things. We, in receiving the advice from the city attorney that this had changed and it needed to be addressed, I specifically looked at all the different choices that could be applicable to different parts of town, and of course we have no discretion. Absent this ordinance being adopted, I'm not sure what we would do when Ocean Colony comes in with somebody with an application for one of the other types of ADUs. I think we'd have some, I think we'd be quite limited in terms of that. This ordinance is implementing local control. On January 1st, we revert to state law just like all the other cities. This is not a Half Moon Bay issue. This is an every jurisdiction topic. We're moving quickly, and we're actually in contact with Coastal Commission staff, and we understand that we're ahead of almost all the other jurisdictions in doing this. So I think it probably feels aggressive, but on the flip side, it is about maintaining what you've wanted in the last ordinance to the extent that we can, because we had a lot of support for that ordinance. So that's why I chose that one. I would expect some applications. I would expect them to possibly be like similar to what I just described. I've heard that over the years from a number of people who are interested. I hope that helps.
Yes, it does. It does. I don't suppose you've had any signal from Coastal Commission about what degree of flexibility they might allow municipalities with regard to PUDs.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure exact. They haven't given us feedback on this draft ordinance. We do coordinate with them, and we met with them just a few weeks ago, actually, with our staff colleagues that we have kind of a quarterly touch base with. They are aware that we are bringing this forward. They're aware that we were looking at how to deal with the PUDs, and I didn't see any red flags. I don't know what they're going to do with this, but this was our best effort to do what, frankly, following Coastal Commission guidance that comes along with the topic of housing is to focus on harmonizing. Harmonize the Coastal Act with the obligations around state housing law. And that's what your land use plan update has done, in my opinion, a very good job of. And that's what we're trying to do here to the extent that we can.
Good. That's well said. One thing you made me think of during your slides was if indeed I support the idea of looking at Measure D fees for the larger ADUs. I think it makes sense for the reasons that you said, and you made me think during your slides maybe there's an opportunity to use a more aggressive fee schedule there if indeed we want to incent the sort of smaller ADUs that we originally envisioned. You know, we could exercise more creativity in those fees.
We can't yet. We will let you. So one thing that is likely going to happen is cleanup legislation, and we will nimbly come right back here with anything that we can that we think is aligned with what you want that provides discretion. That's an area, my understanding is it does not provide discretion. We agree with the comment about how those numbers looked. That's why I put them up there. I think people need to understand what's being imposed is it's pretty complex, and there's a lot of layers to it, and I think some of those things are going to get worked out. Brittany just reminded me one of the one comment that we had very specifically from our Coastal Commission colleagues. They said, well, just make sure that your ordinance doesn't allow development in ESHA. And of course, on page 10, there's code that is protective of that, and so we discussed that with them.
Thank you for that.
Okay, Commissioner Polgar, you have a question?
Yeah, I would also echo Commissioner Holtz and Ruddock's comments in that overall I'm pleased to see the ADUs enabled by an ordinance like this. I don't love all of the the lack of kind of being able to tweak things to work better and accomplish, for instance, keeping them smaller. For instance, I did have so I too was pretty troubled by the fee structure. Glad to hear that as soon as there's an opportunity to make that fair or more fair would be great. And there are a couple kind of minor things. One is I didn't see in the I think I just missed it, but if you could point me to where in the proposed ordinance changes it addresses the Coastal Act modifications to deal with parking. Like there's a map in there, but I didn't see it necessarily in the policy. Maybe I missed it. So that's just a question, kind of a housekeeping question. I just want to make sure it was in there. And then I also was a little bit confused by one of the sections, so maybe afterwards, it was just some of the wording, and I think I just didn't understand it. Not worth discussing. If you want me, I can tell you now, but it's not really a discussion point. And then the only other another kind of housekeeping thing is that in the when you're developing the structure definition, I think I heard you say that it would be something that's not enclosed. And it makes sense, but I thought I saw somewhere in here that conversion of just a covered parking space might be I can't remember if that was part of the streamlined ADU. So just if that is, then maybe be careful, we should be careful about how we define structure as unenclosed.
Sure. So first, the parking section is in 18.33.040. It's on page 7 under G, parking. You probably didn't hit it because it actually hasn't changed. So it's not in red line. This is what we had before, and it continues to carry over.
Thank you.
On the carport thing, so the language that you're referring to is related to when you have to replace parking spots. And so if you, under this ordinance, we would not propose that a carport, which just has like 4 posts and a roof, could be converted to an ADU under the streamlined provision. That's not an enclosed space. However, if you put your ADU there, and you therefore lost the amount of parking that you were required to have for your single family house, then under state law, we can't require you to replace that parking except if you're in the zones that we carve out for coastal access. So it's a little bit of a weird nuance because it sort of implies that you could convert a carport to an ADU, but that is not our intent.
Sorry, I thought of one more. Thank you for clarifying that. And I thought of one more thing. I did. It is worth, I think, taking a look at the emergency situation section, because I think it's part of Measure D, so I think it would be factored in. But it is really, if we're looking at sudden influx of permit applications for ADUs to the point that it's affecting, sewage treatment, water supply, that's the only opportunity for the city to be able to say, whoa, wait a minute, this is going beyond our capacity, and to limit the number of permits that are given to less than I think the 1%, per year. So it's just, I don't imagine that it would be reached, but it's possible with some of the kind of streamlining that's required, et cetera, from this new ordinance. So I just wanted to clarify that.
Thank you. Commissioner Hernandez?
Big picture, we've got less than 5,000 housing units in Half Moon Bay. We need to do what we can to support affordable housing in our community. It is very important. I just want to emphasize that my concern is making sure we address the most obnoxious behaviors that people will go to, and just, recommend that city staff really focus on dealing with those obnoxious corner cases that we all worry about. That's it. I actually think that the state legislatures put a big burden in front of us. I think we've dealt with it nimbly, and I applaud city staff for the way they've approached this.
Thank you very much. Commissioner Benjamin.
Thank you. So, yeah, a couple of thoughts. First, just piggybacking on Steve's questions that sort of touched on Ocean Colony. I'm aware of the ways the roads have been built and the parking has been created in Ocean Colony. And I'm trying to visualize the effects of additional development, additional density in that area, additional cars, and recognizing that the homeowners association, as I grasp the legal analysis, wouldn't be able to say, hey, you can't do that, that's too many cars. And yet there's not very much parking in that area. So I'm trying to understand how that legislative mandate lands on the reality of the land in that area. acknowledging that it's a little different there than it is from much of the other city where there are curbs and there's a lot of parking along the streets. Do you have thoughts about that?
Yeah, so I think the answer to that is, first off, for these streamlined ADUs, it's clear that we cannot require parking. In places where we've required parking, it's because it's been tied to coastal access, which is protected under the Coastal Act, and I don't think we have a coastal access issue in Ocean Colony. And there are certainly many other jurisdictions actually throughout the state, especially rural or semi-rural jurisdictions, that have similar types of curb cut issues, sidewalk issues, that sort of thing that you see in Ocean Colony. That said, I think the answer to this is that the way the development proceeded in Ocean Colony was with the understanding that they were building parking sufficient for the square footage that they were building. We're not proposing to add any square footage. It's just a conversion of the square footage from being part of a single-family house to being part of a single-family house and an accessory dwelling unit. So one would hope, and I think the legislature's thoughts here are that if you have 4 parking spots, the fact that one of them may now be used by the ADU as opposed to your teenage kid living in the back bedroom is equivalent. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but I'm just saying what I think the state legislature would say in response.
Yeah, I certainly wouldn't want to put you in the position of defending the legislature's perspective on this, but my sense is that from the occasions that I've been privileged to visit people in Ocean Colony, that there are very strict limits in the amount of visitor parking that are available. And while some places have palatial driveways, some don't. And it's not obvious to me that, and I could be wrong, but it's not obvious to me that there's plenty of tandem parking or something. We may end up really not having as much room. And my concern is if somebody ends up parking on a very narrow street and creates a safety hazard, and trying to figure out how that works. But I'm not trying to solve that problem. Although I want to have a sense of how you want our resolution to adapt to questions like that, like the concordance question, like the structure question that we don't have the answers for yet, because we don't want to hold this up. We understand the draconian quality of the state law that comes down like a ton of bricks if we don't do something, but I feel like I don't know enough about how to respond to these unknowns yet. I think that another question that I'm struggling with is the ADU short-term rental merry-go-round. It feels like the way the thing has been framed so far doesn't provide a legal structure to say, I'm going to build this ADU, and then some years later, you know what? I don't want that to be an ADU. I want that to be a short-term rental because I don't get to do a deed restriction on the ADU. So I feel like there's a kind of a teeter-totter of increased development density. Similarly, I appreciate that we have Coastal Commission guidance or staff guidance not to develop in ESHAs, but I don't know what they say about ESHA buffer areas. I reread their memo and it was pretty soft. Now, as I understand the Coastal Commission, the purpose of a buffer is to protect the ESHA, but I don't know what the ramifications of that are with respect to Coastal Commission guidance, and working out the details of that ordinance feels important to me because it has ramifications on where these things will and won't be built. And lastly, I am concerned that we are having to raise the amount of development that we used in our calculations of build-out in our LCP. So while this isn't a ramification for this ordinance, it says that this idea that we're going to have more ADUs as a result of this means that our ability to support with infrastructure, as Commissioner Polgar wisely pointed out, not just sewer, not just water, but roadway, and drainage. These are individually minor, but they are cumulatively significant. And if we need to jigger our numbers again to get it, I think it's really vital that we do that. And I hope that a hard enforcement of Measure D limits will give us a limit that we, at least each year, the amount of impact that we get from a new battery of development isn't going to take us over an edge that we don't know how to get back from. Thoughts?
So there was a lot there, and through the chair, we'd like to try to answer
Please.
one of the most specific comments that it's pretty straightforward to answer regarding buffers, et cetera. It's really overtly codified. You've got the protection that you're looking for. I believe staff is looking at it. It's 1833-050, 060, page 10, conformance with certified local coastal program, and very specifically, new accessory dwelling units and junior accessory dwelling units shall conform to all applicable requirements of the city's local coastal program, the zoning code, this chapter, and any existing coastal development permit, including that the proposed accessory dwelling unit will not adversely impact any coastal resources, including any of the following. One of the following is in A, which cites ESHA, including wetlands, riparian, and riparian or wetland buffers, in addition to those specific ESHA. Buffers are listed. So it's here overtly, and then remembering that the city's local coastal program does not include accessory dwelling units as a permitted use in buffers. So it's covered a few ways. Regarding the Measure D, that's correct. We are, I think Brittany already presented to this. We will see what we have for applications in January. And this year's Measure D allocations were approved by City Council on December 3rd. This year will be 69 allocations, and of those, I think 23 of them are outside downtown and 46 are inside downtown. So we would expect most of the accessory dwelling units to be outside of downtown and to probably consume quite a few of those as they did last year. And of course, we didn't have, I'm not really sure that we're going to see junior ADUs, but we'll see what we get with that. Some people may be wanting to have the opportunity for two, and that's the way to get there. But we set this up so every single ADU would require a Measure D certificate.
If I can just follow up on that. So I know that the council intention is to try to concentrate development downtown. And so when you say the ones that are going forward, there are a lot of them that we expect to be coming from outside of the downtown core. Is that because we simply didn't get enough applications from inside?
We didn't get very many, if any, applications inside, but the reason why we got so many outside is because that's where most of the single-family development is, so that's where ADUs are going to tend to be located. And also remember, and it's a frustrating thing to me, that the downtown area is defined as the city's former redevelopment boundary. It is not coterminous with the town center. It's a much different subset of the downtown than what we've been working with, for example, in the local coastal land use plan updates. So those developments in the downtown area you're going to see are applicable to the next item you have before you, talking about your mixed use districts and the like. So I don't think that we can blame ADUs for not having downtown development come forward. I think we'll talk about why we're not getting that in a little bit, hopefully.
Also, if I may, wanted to address Commissioner Polgar's question about this section in 1706.025. So I've reviewed, and yes, this would apply for ADUs. Just so we're clear about what we're talking about here, this is a provision from Measure D, which gives the City Council the authority to put a halt on the issuance of Measure D certificates if certain emergency circumstances are met, including like if you don't have sewage treatment capacity or water service capacity. Because all ADUs require Measure D certificates, they would come under any sort of requirement to halt Measure D.
Through the chair.
Commissioner Bennett.
Thank you. And I had a question about the ADU short-term rental merry-go-round issue. Any thoughts on that?
So we heard from you earlier on this, on the question of whether we could provide deed restrictions to try and limit short-term rentals. That's a question that I unfortunately need to do a little bit more research on to know whether I feel comfortable with that. For that reason, it would be helpful to know from the commission if you are interested, to the extent it's required or it's allowed by law, if you would like to see deed restrictions on short-term rentals, it would be helpful to have you weigh in on that tonight, so we could move forward with that if that's something that we determine is legal. I will also note that we will eventually get to short-term rental regulations. That has been on the agenda for some time, although staff has been quite busy on other urgent issues. And there are some new tools available to cities to encourage additional compliance for short-term rentals, including there's been movement, especially with Airbnb, to regulate the platforms themselves. And so it may be possible to move forward with better regulations to ensure that short-term rentals can be properly managed within city limits.
Sorry, just follow up on that. Just a question related to, we're talking about owner occupancy and short-term rentals, and there seems to be sort of another class of housing that's sort of just never occupied. So, so just a number of, rather larger homes that are in kind of key prime places that seem to really only be used, maybe a weekend or two a year. I think some of them might actually be corporately owned and used as employee perks or something along those lines. Is that something that can be dealt with in any of these?
So happy to talk about that. We have, in your next presentation, I want to talk about next steps in additional packages of code amendments, and one of those is a package about neighborhood preservation. The city is wrapping up a short-term rental survey, and Joe Butcher is in the room here. He's been helping me with that, and that's closing on Friday. We have a significant amount of input. We're looking at that. What I think I just heard you maybe allude to is an empty house tax. We're also looking at a number of other residential sort of helpful measures in terms of neighborhood compatibility around home occupation and small lot infill, things that we've talked about in study session in the past.
Thank you. Commissioner Bennett.
So thanks. So responding to your question about feedback on the ADU short-term rental question, this is a tricky one because the state legislation is about housing. The Coastal Commission is about coastal access. And so there's a interesting creative tension in the organizations. My view is that if whatever we want to allow, we should be doing it with purpose. And if our goal is to facilitate housing, we ought to structure our project to achieve that goal, rather than creating a regulatory bathtub that can slosh from housing to ADUs and potentially all of the adverse impacts. So I'm open to that, but I do not want to see it as part of these proposals. Similarly, for the right kind of Coastal Commission sanctioned short-term rentals in the right places, I'm open to them, but I don't want to see them evolve into housing, at least not without a sense about how we're going to manage the inventory of both, because that would subvert the purpose for which these things were being structured. That's my concern. Stepping back from any of the other minutiae, I mean, I have pages of it here, but just stepping away from it, I'm not a fan of complex regulation. And I'm especially not a fan of pursuing it in that window of time between Thanksgiving and New Year's Day, because it's a time when other people are kind of busy. And I remember when I was sitting on standing on the other side of the die, knocking on the door, I saw stuff that came in and it didn't feel right. And I understand that we wouldn't be doing this at this time of year if if it weren't for the, you know, the jackboot of the state legislation that's going to drop on us on January 1st. So I understand it. But I think for anybody who's watching the meeting, they ought to understand that we're conscious of that. And that's why that's, at least from my perspective, that's why it's here. That said, I'm struggling to understand what I can recommend, because there are, you know, we don't have the ADU short-term rental thing. We don't know exactly how to work structures. It sounds like there are a couple of, you know, the concordance we don't have, but we can ask for that as part of moving this forward. And I'm trying to figure out what is the remedy for keeping this ball moving in the right direction, because it's hard to approve something that's so existential.
So, question to staff, is it really existential, or do you think you can provide a pretty, I feel like I've got a good sense of what you would bring back. You mentioned that you would be able to bring back the concordance. I think I agree with Commissioner Benjamin, that would be helpful in understanding and seeing what the changes are, but I don't think there would be anything in there that would really change my perspective on anything. And I think the question about the structures, thank you. I think what you described made sense to me, and I trust that you can develop some language on that. So I'm comfortable that staff can put that together and capture the commission's discussion and bring it forward to the council with a recommendation, personally.
I would echo Commissioner Holt's comments just now, because I think it is pretty clear to me. I think the only thing that you've brought up or suggested that you might want feedback that that's not in here would be, I think it was the deed restriction. I don't know that I want to add that, but I think you were asking for kind of feedback on whether that's something to look into, and I would say yes, it's worth looking into. So I too would feel comfortable moving forward with a resolution on this.
So that, are we ready to entertain a motion?
Can I just jump in for
Commissioner
a quick
Hernandez,
second?
please, yeah.
I also want to just say, I'm not super supportive of deed restrictions. I am super supportive of a plan that has us deal with short-term rental restrictions. I think it's an important thing for us to look at. That said, homes are for housing, hotels are for access from a coastal access perspective. I think that's really, those are the big bright lines that we have. I do think that some of these short-term rentals offer opportunities for owner-occupant solutions. I'm very supportive of us looking at owner-occupant solutions, but I strongly feel that homes are for housing and hotels are for coastal access. And those are the big lanes that we need to be looking at. I'll also comment that I really don't feel like the state is dropping a jackboot on us, Jimmy. I just think that we're dealing with a crisis right now, and they're maybe a little heavy-handed from a regulatory perspective, but this is aimed at helping the community, helping people have more affordable housing. And so we just need to find flexible frameworks for dealing with this. So I'm very supportive of city staff driving a lot of the day-to-day types of things we need to be looking at, and I'm supportive of what you guys have put forward today.
So I appreciate what you said, all of you. You know, the lack of specificity is obviously something I'm a little less comfortable with than you are on a couple of these things. I like to know what I'm recommending. It's not that I don't trust, it's that, you know, we got a recommendation and we've been able to hone it in some important ways and identify some things that needed to be fixed that weren't in the first round. So I'm not trying to persuade anybody not to recommend this, and I hope you won't consider my unwillingness to support it in its current form as a rejection of the need to address this. It's just my registration that I don't think it's quite there yet.
Noted. I won't be offended, Jimmy. Do we have a motion?
I would move to, sorry, I don't have the paperwork.
I would like to just, when you make your motion, there are three language changes that we've talked about that I want to make sure you're either recommending or not recommending. So that's, the changes would be to add a definition for accessory structures specific to ADUs, to change the fee structure for Measure D certificates to exempt or to require fees for units larger than 350 square feet, or sorry, 750 square feet, and to potentially require short-term rental deed restrictions if allowed by law. So those are the three sort of variations that you could put on the motion that you are about to make.
Is it the will of the commission to go so far as to ask to potentially require deed restrictions?
I think what we asked for was additional information and a discussion around the feasibility of that. So I guess it depends on the definition of potentially allow. I would soften that a little bit, I guess.
We can do the research and bring it to council and report to them that there's actually two options. You could do it here potentially, and we can certainly address it in the more comprehensive ordinance with regards to short-term rentals.
I would be
Me too.
I'm sorry, Sarah, I missed details on the first point. Definition of structures?
Accessory structure specific to Chapter 1833.
Okay, are we good with that? I move that the Planning Commission adopt the resolution in favor of passing the ordinance at hand with the addition of three terms, the first being to add to the language a definition of structure throughout. Secondly, to amend the fee structure to require Measure D impact fees for ADUs of greater than 750 square feet. And thirdly, to return to the commission and or council with exploration of the idea of requiring deed restrictions on ADUs with regards to short-term housing uses.
And then I'll just add, it doesn't necessarily have to be part of the motion, but also the concordance that Jimmy had spoke of, Commissioner Benjamin.
I'll second. Thank you for that.
Second. Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
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 Abstain or not in favor?
No.
Okay. Nice. Okay, so with that is, we're done with that item. I think we are going to take a break. Yes, we will break for 5 minutes or so, and we'll bring it back. Planning Commission meeting, we have item 1B, amendments to the zoning code for the commercial downtown, commercial residential, commercial visitor serving, commercial general districts.
All right, back at this item. So mixed-use districts and parking ordinance. This is a code amendment that has a narrow focus. The presentation will cover a quick bit of background, overview the ordinance, and then conclude as we normally do. This ordinance is in response to multiple inputs, City Council multi-year priority for affordable housing. You saw components of this at a very comprehensive study session on July 23rd. Sarah was there as well. And then I'm going to report out to you about something we did last week on Thursday. City Council passed an interim urgency ordinance that is in effect now, and I will update you on that. This particular item before you is actually follow-on code to that urgency ordinance, so it's very important that we move along with this. And then, of course, the land use plan update, in particular with our ongoing policy and discussion about the town center, that has informed the way that staff worked on this code. These were the topics that you saw on July 23rd. We told you we were working on code amendments. We didn't realize we were going to have to bring ADU up ahead of some of these things. We have done research on below market rate and density bonus. You can expect that in Q1 of 2020. The two that are highlighted, of course, are the item tonight, and then I've already alluded to the package of, we talked about R2, R3 districts, and that is sort of expanded into this concept of neighborhood preservation code. So mixed use, what are those zones? Those are your commercial downtown, commercial residential, commercial general, and visitor serving commercial. So visitor serving commercial tends to be at the north and south ends of town. You know where it is from all the land use plan work we have, and I don't have a halfway decent laser pointer here, but I know the Planning Commission is very familiar with that. The general commercial area is really focused on Highway 1 and 92 at your shopping centers in particular. So the New Leaf Center and that environs around there, and Strawflower and in that area. Then that deeper, darker red in the middle, and then if you look to the left, and I'm sorry I didn't get a fancy map today, I ran out of time. But if you look at the map on the left, the inset map, Joe, you're helping me out over there. So there you go. The commercial downtown is really the heart of your old downtown, and commercial residential is you don't have a lot of properties in it. It's a transition zone. It provides a kind of a gradual transition between your classic downtown shopping district and residential neighborhoods that back up to it. All right, so when we spoke in July, we were focused on uses that affect all these mixed-use districts. And so tonight in my presentation, we'll talk about where we went with respect to residential uses and commercial uses, and then that will lead to some discussion about mixed use as well once we get into parking. But this was that question of, here we have mixed use districts that fully anticipate a combination of commercial and residential uses, and we require a use permit for what should be a principally permitted use in your staff's opinion for residential development. And that was that's the house where you got to evaluate a use permit, whether or not it was appropriate to use the house as a house. We want to not do that anymore, and a whole bunch of other things we probably wouldn't need to do anymore, and it would be, I think, helpful to the commission, to staff, and to our applicants. Commercial uses, we'll talk about Heritage Main Street and that urgency ordinance has, and a focus on what's happened with conversions away from retail. Okay, so just to jump right into what we're proposing with respect to the use permit requirement, we're proposing to make residential uses permitted uses in commercial downtown, commercial residential, and commercial general, but to maintain the use permit requirement in the commercial visitor serving district. Commercial visitor serving does not allow multifamily development. It allows a very limited amount of residential development. It is a special district that is held for coastal access and recreation, and it is prioritized for that. And so we don't see it as having significant capacity. It's also not located in the town center, so it is not the target and the focus of a policy direction that you've had. So you're going to see a very light touch on that zone. You're going to see the most work on commercial downtown. And so we hope that you see that this is reflective of policy direction that we've been receiving for some time. Now, folks will want to know, well, gosh, if you don't have a use permit, what are we going to do about making sure it's okay for new residential development or mixed-use development in these zones, or conversions. Conversions is really what I'm trying to simplify, and we can talk about both of those. But here's the thing, a conversion or new development obviously meets the definition of development under the Coastal Act, but so does a change of intensity of use. Thus, page 4 of your staff report, that's why page 4 says that you still need a coastal development permit, even though you don't need a use permit. Use permit is a tool for making sure that a use that might not be compatible, that you put conditions around it, and you evaluate its ability to meet performance standards or the condition of the particular neighborhood, which is different than just straight up development review. Your staff, I am not concerned about the compatibility of residential development in a mixed-use zoning district, especially at the density and intensity and with the mixes of uses that are already allowed in the zones. And so just sharing with you why there's a difference between a coastal development permit and a use permit. A couple other things that you will notice, you'll notice a number of things through the CD code in particular, but for both commercial downtown and commercial general, we want to make sure that any sites in those zones that are going to be developed for multifamily are used well. They do not have minimum density requirements right now. The R3 zoning district does. It has a 15 unit per acre minimum density requirement. Now, CD and CG kick out to R3 in some cases, but does the minimum density requirement really apply to them? I think that that's not clear, but it could be interpreted that it does. So this is something that you'll note that I think should be overt. And there's a number of other reasons why we'd really encourage this minimum density, because it will affect the built form in terms of mixes of uses. For example, if we don't have that minimum density, we could have a very, very, very large penthouse unit, penthouse in quotes, it's like on the second or third floor, over office, for example. And there's no parking to share, and they're going to want that cool shared parking thing that I'm going to show you in a little bit. So we're trying to get the right amount of both so they balance each other well. Site coverage limit is really differential in the CD zone. Left it alone for all the other districts, but in the CD zone, commercial use is allowed to cover the site fully. Mixed use is left kind of open-ended to your discretion, which means that applicants and staff don't know what's appropriate because it's discretionary, and so we have to kind of whittle our way to it. And multifamily is really restricted and made to it's a very small footprint, and it really doesn't necessarily conform to the heritage development form of an old downtown. So we would recommend not having that site coverage limit in CD for those uses. Now you'll notice R2 and R3, well, I don't mean R2, R3, duplexes and triplexes, I left that alone. That building form is common in downtown, and it has a distinct pattern of development that I would recommend that you maintain. Okay, so then there's a few other things in the code. I'm just trying to highlight them because we don't like surprises, and that's why you've got strike through, underline. There's a code for a solid masonry wall when we have a separation requirement between commercial uses and residential uses. And sometimes a solid masonry wall is the perfect thing, but sometimes it's not. And the other option is for an amount of greenery, of nice landscaping, but we know that landscaping does not blunt noise at all for that much of it. You need 100 or a couple hundred feet to really make an effect on that. I've looked at plenty of noise studies about landscaping. So the solid masonry wall gets to stay, but we would encourage the commission to open this up a little bit to allow for some flexibility, because there's cases where it's just not the right thing. And there's even cases where building the solid masonry wall creates this thing that is hard to get rid of someday. It's probably got rebar in it. It's probably kind of an awful thing when you're ready to get rid of it. So let's not build that if we don't need it. And if you do need it, then that's okay. So just, it's a little picky thing. Another one is residential storage. Half Moon Bay's code does not require, other than for long-term bicycle storage, additional storage for units. And I'd really encourage you to include this. It does a few things. One in particular is it keeps storage out of parking spaces. And if we're going to be looking at reducing parking requirements in the downtown, we need all of those spaces to be utilized for parking. It also helps keep stuff off of nice upper floor open spaces that we like and that we see in our design review process with you and now with the Architectural Advisory Committee. Storage on balconies, storage on decks. So if you actually have some storage space, it's more likely that those spaces will be used for their intended purposes, open space. And then garages. The 2-car garage requirement is one of the #1 things that has been very difficult for development on small sites. The geometry of a small site, the ability to back in and out of those spaces, having probably sometimes only one way in and out of a site, it really ties them up. And it's also, some of these things, not all of them, but some of these things are why you've been asked for a lot of parking exceptions. Okay, so that was residential. That's kind of the simple suite of, it's not a lot, but those things are important, and they're a start. Now, moving to commercial, this is, I'm going to click quickly through. I don't know if any of you saw the urgency ordinance presentation on Thursday night. City Council had a special meeting. It was at 5:30. It was here. And it was a reaction to some really fast turnover on Main Street from retail uses to office uses. We lost the little retail business next to MacDutra Plaza to an attorney last summer, and that was just in advance of us doing our study session. And that was one of the reasons why we talked about restricting uses on the ground floor of Main Street in that study session. Well, we didn't keep up, and I'm sorry to say that we've lost another one. The Press Bagel Shop has converted to a real estate office, and there's vacancies on Main Street, and it's part of our concern. So you're going to see new language in the code about active and ground floor dependent, new definitions, and just thinking about this area, we're focused between Main Street Bridge and Correa Street. We're looking for what's active, what's all about the foot traffic. It's ground floor dependent. There is no way that it will locate upstairs. Bagel shops don't go upstairs. Cafes don't go upstairs. Retail won't go upstairs on your Main Street. So you know that it needs to be on the ground floor. These other uses that we've mentioned, they could all be upstairs. They could all be on a B street or side street. And that just gives you a sense of what you've got. Last summer we picked on City Hall. We did that with council because it's nicer to pick on ourselves. We are an office. We are not a ground floor dependent use. We're pretty active, I will say, because the left side of that building is the community development department, and we keep our shades up, and we have a very fun counter, let me say. But we're stone cold closed on the weekend. We're closed at night. We have a surface parking lot with a curb cut that crosses your nice Main Street sidewalk. That's a sin in my planning world. That's just, we're not going to do that anymore. So you will see things in the code that are no more of that unless it's absolutely infeasible to get property access. So there's all kinds of examples of uses that are not ground floor dependent, and we all get used to them. You get used to walking by them. They look nice, the buildings look nice, but you will start to see patterns. Offices tend to have blinds. They want privacy. Or they've got that piercing sun angle if they're on the sunny side of the street. They don't have storefront displays. They aren't open. You're not going to walk into it. And so the urgency is that there's more than one vacancy. This one in particular is new, it's big, it's at the end of Main Street. I'm really concerned about losing the 300 block of Main Street. This is Old Pasta Moon, and it is really nice to see that it's being marketed as retail space. Obviously, it has a full commercial kitchen, but this is what the real estate people know. The code allows office, and it's a risk. So the urgency ordinance has already prohibited for 45 days such conversions. We are planning to bring that back to council on Tuesday to extend the ordinance for 10 months and 15 days. You can have an urgency ordinance in place for a whole year, and then you can extend it one more year. The purpose of that is to give the city time to finish the actual code that you intend to implement. And we were already working on that, so I don't think we need 2 years. I hope we don't need 1 year because we've got a full code in front of you tonight. This is also evidence as to what's been going on and what, if you mindfully walk up and down those 4 blocks and really look at what's active ground floor and what isn't. Joe did an inventory for me, and then he and I measured everything, and it's eroded, and I'm really worried about it, and that's why we panicked and brought that forward. Okay. So this is what's on the books, and those are your new definitions, and I just wanted to make one mention about what Heritage Main Street is, because that's a really important term for how the code was structured. So Heritage Main Street is the 300, 400, 500, and 600 blocks of Main. They have a distinctly different development pattern than on the other side of the bridge, as well as on the south side of Correas. Once you cross Correas, you'll see that there's a setback and a really different development form for almost all of the buildings. But from the 300 through 600 blocks, even the zoning code today even acknowledges those 4 blocks and their development pattern and a need to maintain a build-to line, not a setback line from the front, but a build-to line, because it's so important to have that classic Main Street shopping area. So sidewalk frontage is what we like. It's what people come to the town for. 1 and 2 story commercial buildings. Why did we call it heritage and not historic? Or it's part of Old Downtown. Old Downtown is a visual resource area. It has a different boundary than this. Historic is a weighted term. It has legal significance, and not all of the buildings on this span of Main Street are historic. So we chose heritage because it actually came from former Commissioner Evans, who's given a lot of input on the land use plan update in thinking about heritage downtown and moving forward in time with probably a downtown plan and other things that we actually have plans to do. So that is how that came to be. And this is just a collage showing there's a lot of variety. Clearly the upper left corner that's retail, you know, when you see it. The bottom right corner is just one small span of window covered office space that you may walk by, and now you'll notice it a lot more, and I'm sorry. And then we have vacancies like the upper right that we're concerned about. And then there's the gray areas. You know, City Hall has a little bit of this and that. The little Zabala House area has this forecourt that probably, you know, that was a great idea, but it's not activated. That's a hole in the streetscape, and it's even worse because to the north, there's a parking lot for all of 6 cars. That could be something else. So, and then what about that bank? We're proposing to not include banks on the ground floor of those 4 blocks. You have plenty of other places for banks. The ATM is cranking, and that's active for sure, but the rest of it, if you watch the door traffic, you'll, I think, agree. We're not expecting Bank of America to move, but we don't want to see another bank, especially replace a retail business. Okay, so a couple other things in the commercial downtown district. You'll notice, I already mentioned that build to line, although I think it was a little too strict because we would want to allow flexibility for some uses to be able to create sidewalk cafe space and the like. Half Moon Bay sidewalks are really narrow, and it's a challenge to have activated outside uses under those circumstances, especially if you're trying to fit in a tree and you must meet accessibility requirements. And many of the businesses have really beautiful, charming outside displays, and it gets pretty crowded. So the flexibility is meant to be carefully administered if there's a new building. And then you will notice code amendments that are addressing parking lots, curb cuts, etc., as already discussed. Okay, the other zones relative to commercial uses, well, with CD and CR together, the commercial downtown and commercial residential, your downtown core, not prohibit, but discourage monument signs. Monument signs are suburban form usually. Sometimes they're used in very charming ways in Half Moon Bay, so they can work, but you want to be careful with it, and so that's just a recommendation. I would recommend popping the bed and breakfast guest room count from 3 to 5, and that's based on some early look at the short-term rental survey that I've seen. People are more comfortable with rentals in the downtown area, and this is an area that would have more capacity, possibly. I don't think it would be snapped up, but it's just a little bit more. And then for all the zones, and I missed it, sorry, on the CG, going the other way here, I would encourage you to consider a use permit requirement for bars and taverns. This isn't for a restaurant that has beer and wine sales. We already require a use permit for any kind of hard alcohol sales. But if you had a bar or a tavern, let's say it's just a brew pub and they really don't have food service, some of the things that happen with that, and it's great, is they might want to have a beer garden, and then they end up going outside, and then we have kind of a challenge that is fun to do, but we've got to make a constrained, defined area that satisfies the Alcoholic Beverage Control Board for their liquor license. So running a use permit in parallel with that kind of use is handy. It's really helpful, and it makes sure everything's coordinated. it is not a burden for those businesses. I've done quite a few of those. So I would recommend that one. And then parking. Okay, so we're getting into it here. Most of the parking code proposed revisions also affect commercial downtown. There are a little bit that go into those other mixed use zones. And we'll talk about multifamily, commercial, and mixed use, and also some changes to the parking exceptions. Staff's hope is that if the parking code is right-sized, you won't be asked to make parking exceptions. And so we've got a couple tools in here for you to think about. Existing multifamily code, no matter where the unit is or how big it is 2 garage spaces per unit. Sometimes the garage spaces are allowed to be a little bit modified in different contexts, but just assume 2 per unit, and it's 1 guest space per each 4 units. We're proposing 1 space per studio and 1 bedroom units, and 1.5 spaces per units with 2 or more bedrooms. And maintain the guest parking, 1 space per 4. This is only for commercial downtown, and I should have said before I jumped into these are all scaled to parking exceptions that the Planning Commission has granted in the past. In fact, they're a little bit more conservative than those, but they scale to those, and I looked at about 20 parking codes, and it was kind of a dive and a qualitative analysis, because it's all true. There's no other town quite like Half Moon Bay, so we have to really curate your parking code. Commercial, right now it's 1 space per 250 square feet for most of the commercial uses other than restaurants. Food service is always more highly parked use. We're recommending 1 per 300. That's a really standard code for a downtown environment. Cities that have a transit stop will even require less than that for office use, because they get so much journey to work by their transit. I would obviously not recommend that here, because we don't have that. The restaurant code is really strict at 1 per 45. Now note that this is the service area, it isn't the whole space. That net is referring to the active piece of the use. I saw a lot of range of code. I've used a lot of codes. I'm recommending that you move to 1 to 75 square feet, only in the downtown, and then I didn't note here, it's also plus 1 per employee. I would keep that, and what that does for you is account for differences between the intensity of restaurants. You know they're all really, really different, so that's a way to scale that. Mixed use. So it's basically the existing code is what I just shared with you, and then it's additive. So if you had the residential, you do the 2 per unit plus the guest, 1 per 4 units, probably 1 space per 250 square feet of commercial, unless it's a restaurant. And then there's some allowances for shared parking, but it's not defined at all, and it's why you are asked for exceptions. What we're proposing is, as you just saw for residential, and as you just saw for commercial, that they just be those modest reductions, and that they also be added together. And then this is where, for your consideration, there's predefined, if you want to think of them as parking exceptions, I gave them other names, but they're predefined, and they have some guardrails around them, which frankly makes staff a lot more comfortable. It helps applicants. They know what is within the realm of your comfort zone. So there are 2. One is for mixed use. One is, and they're both discretionary, except for one little caveat. discretionary of the Planning Commission. So the mixed-use shared use reduction would be up to 20%. And what the commission would be looking for is, are these uses a good partnership? Do they work together? If you could imagine on Church Street, housing over office, that's a good relationship. Office peaks during the weekdays, housing peaks at night and on the weekends with respect to parking demand. And those two uses have classically been studied as being really good at sharing parking. Retail can be good as well. You have to be really careful with restaurant, and so that's something that we would be careful with in bringing that forward. So mixed-use shared use reduction with description of how and when you might consider it with that 20%. San Luis Obispo has this 20% reduction. I worked with a code in another city that had 25%, and it worked great, and that was not near Caltrain. That was on, that was away from a downtown. So, but I didn't think we were ready to go. I don't think you need to go that far. Guest parking waiver. This is another discretionary idea for you to consider. We would encourage, in the way it was coded, that this be okay on Heritage Main Street, because it is hard to park development in a way that guests to residential are going to park in that parking lot, and your building form is, it's pretty persnickety and fragile to get it right. So this is just another burden in those 4 blocks. You don't have to keep that like that in the code, of course, and then the guest parking waiver could apply to other parts of town. We strongly recommend, though, that the finding be really related to what's going to happen with those guests. The guests are going to park on the street. The guests are going to use public land. They're going to use the right-of-way. So we would suggest that if you're going to consider this, that you look for a public benefit from the applicant, like a public EV charging station, like a publicly available car share, a zip car, some kind of bike share, some really important, significant improvement to ADA access. Whatever it is, it's public. It's not something cool and neat that they did on their property. It's something for the public because they're using public space. Okay, I'm a protector of the right-of-way. This is this is what the city engineer and your planners do. So I hope that makes sense. And then the parking exception is still in your code, but we would hope that it would. You'd look at those first 2 things first before you jump to that conclusion. Here's 3 scenarios really, really quickly. The first one is 8 2-bedroom units. Your current code would require 18 spaces. With the proposed code, it would be 14. If we took both of those reductions, well, no, wait a minute. You can't take both reductions. You can only take 1 reduction for the residential. If you take the waiver on the guest parking, you get down to 12. Then there's single-use retail. That's pretty big retail space. It could just as well be office. 3,000 square feet. Right now, the code would require 12. As proposed, it would be 10. There's no reduction for single-use commercial. Okay? There's no fluff in it. So if there happens to be a commercial use that's really unusual, maybe it's like an artisan studio or something, and they're just not going to come close to needing that, then they can go to the parking exception, and you might have real findings. But you should be worried about building new buildings for uses like that when the use can change. So just thinking about that. And then just adding these 2 things together. If you had 8 units on top of that, 3,000 square feet, how would the numbers run? Currently, oops, I missed a number. Currently you need 30. I'm sorry, this all happened quite late this afternoon. Proposed code is 24. And I am confident, because I did the numbers 3 times, that if you applied the 20% reduction and waived the 2 guest parking spaces, you'd be at 18. So that number in the lower left should be 30. 30 parking places for that much development is, you're never going to build that development. Your parking code is killing the ability to redevelop the site across the street from City Hall. There's no question in my mind. I've tried to block it out, and it can't be done with the height limits that we have, the water table that we have, the geometry of the site. There's no room to do underground parking there. There's no financial capacity to support that kind of parking. So that's what's going on. Okay. So then the other zones, that was all CD, all commercial downtown. At this time, your staff is not suggesting changes in any of those ratios, and only in the configuration around garages, making it a little more flexible. And there's a different reason for each zone, why we would recommend that you wait to do that, and it's something you can always do someday. The commercial residential is that transition zone. We already talked about that. It's anticipated to have to receive overflow from commercial downtown, of parking, of activity, of all kinds of things. If we get it a little touchy on parking too, then the overflow is just going to spread. And we want to protect it for the quality that it has, and I would wait until we do our town center plan later, and we can have a more comprehensive look at how those different parts of town work together relative to parking, or if we can find some good places to develop public parking lots, that would be helpful. But we haven't done that yet. So I just think we would suggest it's premature. And I also don't think you're leaving any good projects on the table in those zones because they're so small. CG, these are pod sites. They're on their own. They're not hooked into the street grid. So they are, they're one-offs, and when they redevelop, I think that's the time to look at what the mix of uses might be. So for example, if you had some shopping center retrofit like we've talked about in the past, that would be one to look at the parking. I think there's just way too many variables for messing around with that right now, and I'm not seeing them to be overparked. They are not super overparked. I don't think you have a lot of wiggle room in most of the shopping centers. And then CVS, we got to protect it for coastal access, and it's also not where you're going to put housing. So it's just not, it's not really relevant to this part of our zoning amendment and the intent for it. The exceptions, you will notice that so there's a long list of findings required for parking exceptions in 1836. That's the Parking Standards Code. It now refers out to the mixed-use districts in the case that someone's seeking a parking exception in those districts. You have to make all the findings that are in the parking code, and you have to make all the findings that are in the specific zone. That's true now, but those two code sections don't talk to each other, and we've had people only look at one or the other and they think they know everything, and it will help staff too someday who doesn't know that they're connected. So it's just about clarity. Then when you go into the mixed-use districts, both of those code sections, so CDCR is in 1807, commercial visitor serving and commercial general is in 1808. Those findings are quite a bit modified. Historic resource is still a finding. It's probably the best finding you can make to grant a parking exception. But the other finding, that wonderful finding about, oh, the applicant has done everything they possibly can do. Okay, your staff struggles to know how to make that finding. I don't know how the commission does it. I always have to ask, well, did you try to make your project smaller? Because it's not a feasible finding. So we would recommend a new finding that is supporting evidence. Two pieces to it. One is that it will not cause harm. You've done a parking demand study. You know how much parking the use actually needs and how much can be parked on site versus off site, so you know what the effect will be if you grant the exception. And you're granting it because there is an actual economic assessment that was prepared. It's a real study. It's not an applicant saying it doesn't pencil out. Okay? So this is my other side of the hill talking to you here. I had to learn coastal planning with you guys, and it's been very painful, but I know how to do this. So anyway, we're getting to the end here. A few other considerations. You'll notice there's a number of new definitions that just made it easier to code. You already saw Heritage Main Street. You saw active, ground floor dependent. We added a definition for mixed use. I don't know why there wasn't one. There wasn't. And we added one for EV parking space. We put a new topic in the parking code. It is not meant to be the end-all be-all on this topic. It's setting the table to do more there about low-emission vehicle parking, and we look forward to your feedback on that and would expect that to develop more over time with the climate action and adaptation planning that's coming. We had to poke on the residential code because there's confusion about when guest parking is required with duplexes and triplexes, and it's specifically not required, but the code was awkward. And so we're overtly saying it's not changing what is on the books. Now you're gonna see the R2 and the R3 code later with the neighborhood preservation packet. So if you have other thoughts about it, of course you can tell us now and we can change that, but we were not prepared to amend the R2, R3 code right now, other than to clarify it. There's more bicycle parking required in residential for long-term parking, and we also added to the table some really, really common uses like office that just weren't listed. It was kind of, so we always had to go to the not otherwise listed use category, which is kind of weird. So a lot of this was meant to just make the code modestly easier to use and narrowly focusing on the things that are troublesome for the kind of development that council wants. And this code, in my opinion, could sit for years and be helpful. It is also a pivot point. It reflects your land use plan update and work that we'll do for implementing it, and it can evolve. You write codes and they get changed, and that's okay. But this is a pretty protective code, and I'm happy to answer questions. You know our process. If you're too tired to get through it all tonight, we are holding January 14th for a continuance if you want to continue this item to a date certain. So I'm telling you that now in case I can see it's almost 10 and we had a lot of ADU and this is important. So just know that, so don't feel rushed. And you know we would need to go all the way through the Coastal Commission review. Our next step, as I already mentioned, is to see council on Tuesday to extend that urgency ordinance, which also takes some heat off of you from getting through this tonight with respect to protecting the ground floor of Main Street, because that's under control right now. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There's nothing tiring about talking about zoning and parking at 10 o'clock at night. Okay, so clarifying questions. Just one question. Could you just let me know kind of like what your outreach to the business community and the heritage corridor was, and notification and sort of what you heard from those property owners and business owners?
So the urgency ordinance is not a widely noticed ordinance, and that's how they are done. It's a 24-hour agenda posting. I notified the chamber so that they could notify the Downtown Business Association. It's important for them to be done in that manner. Now, for your Planning Commission study session last summer, that was broadcast all over the place. For this meeting, we broadcast all over the place. We had a public hearing notice in, now I can't remember which newspaper I put it in because we have so many ordinances going, but one of two, it was either in the Review or the Journal. I think this one was in the Review, okay. And then we mailed to every property owner in all of these mixed-use districts. It was a huge mail out, and we had 5 staff people do it. It was a full afternoon of mailing notices, and we posted, we put it in e-news, we put it on Nextdoor, and our communications person got the word out. So the word got out for this for sure, and I talked to the chamber and a number of other people who have been coming in, and they're really upset about the conversions on Main Street. So I have told them that this is coming. And I've even told the people who have converted properties that this is coming. I've told them before they've bought buildings and signed leases that this is coming. People have been told. They knew that this was on our minds and that we wanted to do this.
Okay, great, thank you. Other clarifying questions?
Brian?
Commissioner Benjamin, and then we'll get to you here.
I'll be quick. So there was a perception, I think, in the old days with respect to the value of use permits as being a trigger to facilitate a coastal development permit. And what I understand from the way the new ordinance information is provided is that we're going to treat a change in use from office to retail or office to house or between retail and house, any of those as a change in intensity of use that would trigger a coastal development permit, so that the use permit as a basis for triggering a coastal development permit would no longer be necessary. Did I get that right?
I think so. I don't know why we would have needed it for a trigger because of our definition of development. So your staff is already practicing, so it's,
Yeah, I'm not.
you
I'm-
have the history.
Yeah, I'm not defending
Yeah.
the old practice. I just want to be sure I understand why we can safely discard it.
Yes.
And is there, and I appreciate that staff's values, is that reflected in code somewhere, or is that a discretionary thing?
I mean, that's reflected in the Coastal Act's definition of development.
Well, change in intensity of use is certainly.
Yes.
But, you know, could we come in with a different planning director, you know, in a parallel universe where you have a mustache and say, well, you know, changing it from office to house, that's not really a change in intensity of use? Or is there something in the code that lets us say that?
There's some discussion in the code about what constitutes a change in intensity of use, actually around what we added for ADUs, around addition of habitable space or just certain changes. Mostly it comes, though, from coastal commission decisions, and so there's a body of law around what constitutes a change in intensity of use.
Case law.
Yeah, which is, and just commission practice, which is what staff relies on in making those determinations. I don't know if it's otherwise codified in Half Moon Bay's code or elsewhere.
When you were talking about the masonry wall, it sounded like the objective I was aware of, one of the objectives that you were talking about, and the one that I was most aware of, was sound attenuation or vibration attenuation. There's also sort of, when I think to when the Three Amigos got their big improvement a few years before you came, there was some question about the immediate residential stuff next door. And the idea is that that wall also provides some clear delineation and creates that sense of something different on the other side of that. Is there a way in your mind that we could define that, you know, instead of prescribing a masonry wall or prescribing some set of options, is there some management by objective way to do that, that will preserve that and other options that you think would be more effective?
I think that's a great comment. You could add performance standard criteria such as concerns about noise, glare, vibration, just any of those transitions from one use to another, where, yes, a restaurant, a busy restaurant with a dumpster and all that stuff next to residential, that's a good place for the wall.
Or SAM plant.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Maybe one of those.
So, and then one last question, then I'll get off. When we propose these changes, we're always wondering about how to, you know, we're forecasting how we think it's going to change things, and we never know if we quite get it right. And I appreciate your comment earlier that we can put something in the zoning, and if it doesn't, we can tweak it a little bit and try to make some change. One thing that Commissioner Hernandez and I spoke about, and I think the Commission has expressed some interest in, is some kind of parking structure in the future out there somewhere. And there was a model in the back of my mind that sort of ran analogous to the deferred street, complete streets program. That, you know, you don't need it right now, but there's a point in the future where you do need it. And if there's a way that we can set up triggers to say, okay, we're doing permits now, and yeah, there are these exceptions, but you know, we know there are more ADUs coming. There's, you know, building density bonuses. People are redeveloping these sites. Pretty soon, these areas are not going to have enough parking, and at that time, we need to hit the button and begin getting more resources to build that structure. Is that feasible here?
I think that's something that should be included in your town center plan.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Hernandez.
I'm supportive of the emergency ordinance. I think it's logical, and we need to figure out what we're going to do in the retail areas on Main Street. This is very important. I don't have a lot of other comments around things outside of the emergency ordinance. I will just say that when we think about parking, we should be looking at something like a supercharger station on Main Street so we can get people to park on Main Street with those nice new Teslas, and other types of things where we can get electric vehicles to park in a place where we deem it appropriate. I love the fact that I live in a farm town by the beach near the Silicon Valley, but one of the problems I have on Main Street is some of my neighbors have exceptionally long vehicles, trucks that are like bigger than the Tesla Cybertruck, and they park on Main Street. And so we have width restrictions in the parking ordinance, and one of the things I'd love to look at is, can we have, at least on Main Street, explicit length restrictions that are painted in? Because it's just kind of crazy to have our drive down Main Street blocked by 2 or 3 trucks. It's a safety issue. I think it's something we really need to look at when we look at this ordinance. That's all I have right now.
Great. Commissioner Polgar or Reddick, do you have any quick questions for staff before I open up public comments? None? Okay. So I'm going to open up the public comment period. I've got one speaker's card here. I have another card from Ed Love. I see he's left. So Jules Sofer.
Commissioners, I'm going to speak with two hats here. When I have my hat on, I'm speaking as a real, as someone who's had a retail shop on Main Street for 30 years and is now retired. And when I take my hat off, I'll speak to you as a landlord in that area that you're planning to restrict offices in. And the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take a quick aside on parking, because Mr. Kavanaugh, when he added to the back of his building on Main Street, which is just opposite my building, he was told he needed 3 parking spaces. Well, he didn't have 3 parking spaces to give, and he wanted to add on to the back for an office. So he said to the city, why don't you charge me what it would cost for you guys to build 3 parking spaces, and I'll be happy to pay it. The city didn't take him up on it, and they let him go ahead and build those 3 spaces. But I think that was 25 years ago, and I think the time has come for the city to do something about the fact that they don't have any parking lots. They ought to put one either at the north end of Johnson or at the north end on the other side of down where I think the Catholic Church is down there. There's a lot of land they could put a parking lot on. And if people are asking for some sort of construction that requires more parking than they can give, that it's not possible to do, the city should be collecting fees from them that they can then put toward a parking lot. That just makes so much sense. To just go ahead and keep on forgiving it until we run out of parking is silly. And I think the city should explore that. Now, back to the emergency. As someone who's had a shop for 30 years, retail needs retail. And I'm perfectly okay with this emergency ordinance. And I think it should go ahead. Retail does need retail. It helps everybody. Now, as a landlord, 3 years ago, I tried very hard to fill my office.
He's wearing 2
Can
hats.
I have another minute?
You're wearing 2 hats, so we can give you some.
Okay. So I tried to fill my shop, and I tried for 6 months, and then I couldn't do it. So I went and allowed an office to come in there. I wasn't happy about it, and that's just the way it is. So I think that what you need to do is you need to leave a little wiggle room. And the way you could do a little wiggle room in your ordinance is to offer a landlord help. Like, if I wanted to build a baseball stadium, maybe you would go out and you would recruit. Well, okay, this isn't a baseball stadium. I just need help filling my shop. But you might recruit. You might help recruit. And landlords would probably find it would be easier if the city had some sort of an entity or office where they could go and get that kind of help from the city in recruiting, at least in these blocks that we're talking about. That would be a carrot that you're offering the landlord. Another way you could do it is you could say, well, maybe if you've made a bona fide effort for maybe a year trying to fill the spot, rather than just having it shuttered, we'll let you go ahead and put in something else for a short term. I don't know what the answer to this is, because it's obviously fraught with all kinds of problems. But I think what you need to do is not come at this in a punitive way without offering some kind of help, because it's hard sometimes to find a retailer. I tried very hard. We needed a shoe store. I went to every shoe store in the Bay Area. This was 3 years ago. I couldn't get anybody to come in. Okay, so that I've taken up more of your time, and I know it's late. Everybody wants to go home. But, one other thing, and this is a cautionary tale. Back in 1970, the city wouldn't let what was it? The railroad, Ocean Shore. Ocean Shore was being built, and where we are right now. And the city said only offices, no retail in the development. And of course, they ended up with a white elephant around their neck, and it's still not a great going thing, but they did finally relent and allow retail on the ground floor. But for years, I mean, this place where we are right now is dead. So that's it.
Thank you. Thank you. I see former Commissioner Emeritus John Evans. Yeah, feel free.
I just wanted to address this emergency ordinance, a couple of suggestions. I know that you can't respond to me, and I understand that. When I glanced through it, I didn't see a distinction between existing buildings and new buildings. I think the direction you're going here is great, and it's got a lot of promise and a lot of great concept to preserve the scale of these blocks of Main Street as well as the surrounding commercial district. That's great. I think there's some unintended consequences if you apply some of these restrictions to the existing buildings. There's also a piece of this where you're kind of legislating a design before the design is created. You don't have the specific plan for downtown yet. So there's a lot of that. I think that's one of the complexities of why there's going to be a lot of issues around limiting what businesses go on Main Street. The marketplace being one of them, as Mr. Sofer pointed out. We used to call it the Main Street Shuffle. Go from the east side to the west side, and these businesses would move around. So, and maybe there's a way in this ordinance with the existing buildings where you're going to restrict some uses to not be on the ground floor, to not have to be that a permanent ordinance. There may be some other language, because once this is an ordinance, it's my understanding it's pretty difficult to change. It has to go back through the Coastal Commission. It's a lengthy process. So if there were one little building that was a complication, that would be too small to trigger changing a whole ordinance. So there may be another language and mechanism where you're saying if a use is, instead of not permitted, maybe it's discouraged and it needs some other kind of permitting that you go through that isn't requiring a change in the ordinance. It may be the day comes where our town of this little section of the town is maybe even a state park, because it is so unique, and it may not be a retail center. We don't know what's happening going forward with the marketplace. But what we do know is we have some buildings that need to be preserved if we want to keep the character of what we have, and there needs to be a mechanism to pay for that, and right now the only mechanism to pay for that is through rents that the landlords collect. So an unintended consequence would be something, for example, if there's someone, let's say, has a professional office or maybe a physical therapy office, and you're saying, well, that has to be upstairs. Well, what I know from our continuing education, sadly, is that a professional office, if an accountant sees people, that is then a public space, and it needs to be accessible. And so if it's upstairs, it's not accessible unless there's an elevator. And as we know, most of these older buildings, we don't have a place to put these elevators inside these buildings. And even if we did, the cost is never going to get paid back through recovered revenue. I've used my time. Thank you very much. And actually, Joe Brennan was the originator of the word Heritage Main Street. So credit where credit is due.
Thank you very much, and good to see you again. So that's a last speaker that I saw. So we'll close the public comment period, bring it back to the commission. I'll note it's 10:15. We do have to, if we are going to stay beyond 10:30, have to have a motion to do that. So as Jill mentioned, we could bring this back at a date certain, or we could move expeditiously now. I did have some questions. I share some of the concerns around the marketplace and empty spaces on Main Street, and certainly I prefer to see places occupied rather than vacant. Some other questions came up about, say, just theoretically, Cunha's were to close down, and perhaps there was some subdivision of that building in some way, or something like that. If there were, if there office in the back or in retail in the front, some of those types of things. So for like La Piazza, where you have a number of tricky spaces that are kind of in the back there that have traditionally haven't been able to be rented out. I mean, I'm assuming they'd be restricted to retail.
That's a good example. That building form is showing that retail has to be on the street. We could add something to the code to define the depth of the wrap around the corner, or the depth of, it's usually on a corner property where this happens. You want to get at least 50 feet back. Most of those lots are 100 feet deep. There's plenty of codes that do this. If the wrap is around the corner is deep enough, then you hold the corner with the active use. So that's an easy code piece to do. I didn't do that because I thought it would come out in the town center plan. I also didn't do anything with window transparency. That can come through in a town center plan. I'd be happy to talk to you about this fuzzy range of uses that are maybe active but not necessarily ground floor dependent. Lots of towns have tried to do that. San Carlos has one right now. It's like a walk-in office is how they define it.
Would that be like a chiropractor's office?
No, because that's appointments. It really needs to be, I'm going to go down the street and go in, and I can go in. The barbershop, I can drop in. Yeah, so I'm happy to talk to you more about this, but one thing if we're going to continue, think about it over the break, so to speak, and I hope you'll be spending time downtown. This is only 4 blocks, and it's only the ground floor. And those other uses don't have to be upstairs on Main Street. There's lots of other sites for them. I've seen the slippery slope of when you start to turn the corner on it, and then there's an economic cycle that makes it hard to lease, and then you get an office and you can't get rid of it for 10 or 20 years. It's really fragile right now. So we can get you some more data about it, and I understand what I'm hearing, and it's
is there have you seen in other places that putting a term on, it was mentioned, if we're not able to rent something, like letting an office space be able to come in for a certain period of time.
And then they'll ask you for an extension. It will never stop. I am done this for 20 years. So let's think about, I really like Jewel's idea about the recruitment and what that means. I don't know if that's the city's role, but what that really means for Half Moon Bay, and trying to get some more retailers here. I think it's important. The demising of cuñas is a great example of something that we could absolutely handle doing, that as an example, not that it's on the table. I want to be clear with anybody watching. We have no application for demising cuñas. So I will look at some more codes as well and show you what the options are. But I'm really cautious about doing this, and you can change your code if it's not working. It's okay to do that too. So anyway, think about it, and whatever other comments you have, I want to see
Yeah,
what
I think
can
that'd
do.
be great. I mean, think about the Pasta Moon space in particular. I mean, that's a big retail space, and envisioning another restaurant of that caliber coming in and occupying it, versus it sitting there empty for X period. It's a question of trade-offs for me, I guess. Yeah.
We think that space will either need to be, as you said, a big restaurant, or it will need to be broken into smaller pieces. The field trip to take, San Carlos is a good field trip for you to take. The scale of the buildings and the size of the lots is similar to some of what you have. And it will give you a sense of how the spaces have broken up. I worked in Road City, where that downtown used to have department stores. And of course, department stores left downtowns, they moved to malls. Those spaces were disastrously challenging to get tenanted. They had to be broken up. They were hard to break up. You have good scale here. There's a few that are big, like Pasta Moon, but most of them are pretty small, and that works better for the kind of retail that you're looking for. So anyway, that's just one field trip. There's a lot of great little peninsula towns that can give you good examples, and if you see something you like with a mix of uses, just tell me and I'll learn their code.
Great. Well, yeah, I remember when it was Deadwood City, so and all the work you've done down there was definitely has been noticed. Others, Jimmy?
Thanks. So cryptically, in contrast to the first item on our agenda, I actually was very comfortable with this item. I was ready to go.
Can we just pause this right now and just savor that?
It happens all the time. But I also respect, I appreciate that it sounds like there's a genuine interest for more information, and I want to be sure we get it. So I totally respect that. I will say that for the 20-odd years I've lived here, I have periodically heard from tenants of downtown properties that they felt that they were being driven out, or the paper was lamenting that people had to move because rents were increasing. I never heard anybody say, this is great, the rents are coming down. And so I kind of wonder about the supply-demand curves, the elasticity of demand. And, I'm not the expert, and I'm certainly not saying the landlords have shown an unwillingness, but I'm guessing that there are tenants who would occupy these things at certain prices. There's some elasticity. And I don't think it's the Planning Commission's job to always prevent the elasticity from limiting the potential profit of the owner of the land. I want to see the market function here. That said, happy to get more information. I really like the idea of the parking structure concept that our former architectural review board member, and one of the men who got me into Half Moon Bay politics in the 1990s, you can blame him, had comments on. And I thought John's points were well taken about the challenges for certain types of offices and the public space ramifications. So certainly there's a lot going on here, and maybe as we look at it more, some of these things will clear up. It could be that it would be fine at an earlier hour, that we're just fading. And that's the most compelling reason. We don't make good decisions when it's late. So I would support the continuation.
Yeah, just to be clear, I mean, I support this. I think we heard a willingness from staff to come back and bring additional information.
Move to continue to January
14th.
14th, date certain.
I'll second it.
All in favor?
Yes.
Aye.
Aye.
All right, thank you very much. So that's the end of our public items, and that brings us to the director's report. We got 3 minutes. We can do that.
All right, January 14th, we know one of your items. The other is going to be a parklet in front of Cafe Society. That particular item was already looked at by the Architectural Advisory Committee. It was noticed incorrectly for a director administrative review. I wanted it to be at a hearing. We heard from quite a few folks that they were concerned about it, so I'm deferring it to you. I'm not going to make a decision. The decision date was Monday, and I've moved it into your realm. We will renotice that item. City Council on December 3rd set your Measure D allocations. They adopted an ordinance. Well, they did a first reading for a rental security measure ordinance. December 5th, we've already discussed their special meeting. December 17th, they will be asked to extend the interim urgency ordinance. They will do a second reading on the rental security measures. Architectural Advisory Committee, on Friday, we moved their meeting up to clear the holiday time for their December meeting. They will look at a house on Myrtle. I've referred it to them. It will come to you, but it has so many variances that our intent was to not send many things to the Architectural Advisory, or many single-family homes to the Architectural Advisory Committee. But this one just has a real suite of variances that I think you will be pleased to have the committee's input about when it comes your way. And then there's also a review of a very early kind of planning for Main and Kelly, the corner, the old gas station site. That is going to the committee. Their agenda packet is posted online, so go ahead and take a look at those plans if you're interested. Tomorrow night, the Parks and Recreation Commission, we've already mentioned, will give their final comments on the Poplar Gateways plan. It will be pulled together for a council update in January, and then you will see it as a commission with an environmental document. December 12th is also a Poplar item, a complete streets discussion. It's really more focused with the neighborhood. And then Friday night, City Hall will be open. It's Night of Lights, and we like to be trying to be retail. We will have hot cider and cookies, and staff will be there and happy to work with community and talk with anybody. And so we hope you can swing by. And kids and dogs are also always welcome. Thank you.
Is January 14th our next meeting? We don't have anything intervening during the holidays. We can just follow up later. It seems like one Tuesday is the 24th.
It
and
is.
The other one's is
January
31st.
14th is your next meeting. You, no one's meeting Christmas Eve. So, by the way, City Hall will be closed January 24th through, or excuse me, December 24th through January 1st. So we'll be back open on January 2nd.
Very good. Let's see, do we have any commissioner communications or a motion to adjourn?
Move to adjourn.
Second.
All right. All right. Aye. We all said aye at different times. All right. Thank you, Rick. Enjoy